Hey guy, welcome to Sleepy Sagas. In the quiet hours of the night, you may have heard the whispers of a name that echoes across centuries, carried on the cold winds of dark forests and the turning pages of old books, Dracula. A name that conjures images of a blood-drinking count, cloaked in darkness, watching from the shadows of crumbling castles. But behind the legend of Dracula stands a real man, Vlad the Impaler, whose reign in Wallachia was marked by rivers of blood and forests of stakes, where the cries of the condemned were said to echo beneath the moonlight. Stories claim that he drank the blood of his enemies, that he feasted among the dying, that he ruled with a cruelty so profound it became the foundation of nightmares. They say that 20,000 bodies marked his path, and more lay hidden in the shadows of his ambition. Yet history, with its silent patience, holds deeper truths beneath the layers of fear and rumor. Was Vlad truly a monster? Or was he a ruler forged by the merciless realities of medieval survival, standing between his homeland and the advancing tides of empires? As we drift deeper into this story, we will walk through the misty roads of Wallachia, listen to the silence of the cold mountains, and carefully separate the truth from the darkness of the legends that still haunt the world today. Part 1, Child of Shadows, Early Life and Historical Context. In the hush of an early dawn, before the first rooster calls, and before the thin mist that clings to the earth begins to rise, there is a silence that holds the stories of the land. If you were to stand in the valleys of Wallachia, with its rolling fields of wheat and its dense, whispering forests, you would feel the weight of centuries pressing softly upon your shoulders, like a cloak woven from the threads of countless lives that once walked these paths. Wallachia was a land caught between giants, a fragile ribbon of fertile plains and forested hills squeezed between the ambitions of mighty neighbors. To the south, the swelling strength of the Ottoman Empire, ever expanding, its sultans dreaming of dominion over lands near and far, its armies crossing rivers and seas in their hunger for conquest. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary, a kingdom of knights and kings, seeking to secure its own borders against the same Ottoman tide, wary of its vassal states and watchful for any signs of rebellion or weakness. Between them lay Wallachia, a land neither truly free nor entirely conquered, forced to pay tribute to keep armies at bay, yet often unable to pay enough to ensure lasting peace. This was a land where tribute shifted like sand, where gold was given 1 year to the Sultan in Constantinople and the next to the king in Buda, while the people continued their daily lives under the constant threat of raids, taxation, and the call to arms. The rivers that cut through Wallachia, like the Alt and the Argesh, carried more than water. They carried stories of travelers and traders, whispers of approaching armies, and sometimes the desperate cries of villagers whose homes were set alight by raiders in the night. The roads that ran from village to village were narrow and often muddy, lined with trees that seemed to lean inwards, hiding the footsteps of messengers hurrying with news of shifting alliances or the sighting of foreign banners on the horizon. In this landscape, the villages were small, clusters of wooden homes with straw-thatched roofs, smoke curling gently from the chimneys in the morning air. Chickens scratched at the packed dirt near doorways, and the lowing of cattle echoed through the valleys. Life was simple, and it was hard. Families worked the fields from dawn to dusk, tilling the earth to coax food from the soil, always wary of the sudden arrival of tax collectors demanding more grain than they could spare, or soldiers requisitioning livestock for their next campaign. The nobility of Wallachia, the boyars, lived in larger wooden manors surrounded by high wooden fences, or in stone fortresses perched on hills, overseeing the villages and lands that provided them with wealth and power. But power in Wallachia was as fragile as the frost that could ruin a harvest overnight, and alliances among the boyars were as fleeting as the morning mist. Betrayals and shifting loyalties were a part of life, as each boyar sought to increase his own influence, sometimes aligning with Hungary, sometimes with the Ottomans, and sometimes against their own voivode, the Prince of Wallachia, if it served their interests. The voivode himself was both a ruler and a pawn in this delicate balance of power, often facing conspiracies among his own nobles while under the constant threat of foreign intervention. To rule Wallachia was to rule over a kingdom of fragile borders and fragile loyalties, a land where a single misstep could mean the loss of the throne, or even one's life. This was the world into which Vlad III, later known as Vlad the Impaler, was born. During the early 15th century, Wallachia was already accustomed to paying tribute to the Ottoman Empire, a bitter necessity to avoid the devastation of invasion. But the tribute was never enough to guarantee safety, for the Ottomans demanded more each year, testing the boundaries of their vassals' obedience, while Hungary watched with suspicion, ready to intervene should Wallachia appear to lean too closely toward its southern neighbor. In times of weakness, Wallachia was a prize to be taken, and in times of strength, it was a shield against greater threats. Yet in the quiet of its forests, the people of Wallachia continued to live, tending to their flocks, weaving cloth, and gathering around fires at night to share stories of heroes and ancestors who once fought to defend their homes. They whispered of the great forests that protected them, of the rivers that provided fish and trade, and of the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks hidden in the clouds like silent guardians watching over the land. There were old songs that mothers sang to their children as they fell asleep, songs of princes who rode out to battle, of victories won against impossible odds, and of dark nights when the stars seemed to hide behind clouds as armies approached from the distance. These songs were both a comfort and a reminder that the peace of Wallachia was always fragile, held together by the courage of those willing to defend it and the endurance of those who remained behind to rebuild after each storm passed. In the marketplaces of Targovist and other towns, traders arrived with goods from distant lands. Salt from the mountains, spices from the east, and cloth from the cities of Hungary and beyond. These markets were alive with the sounds of bargaining, the calls of merchants selling their wares, and the laughter of children weaving between the stalls, unaware of the heavy shadows that often accompanied the lives of their parents. But even in these moments of life and trade, the presence of armed guards was a constant reminder that peace was always temporary, and the threat of conflict was never far away. Wallachia's strategic importance came at a heavy cost. Its fertile fields that fed its people also attracted the eyes of invaders, and its position as a crossroads made it a battleground for empires seeking to expand their influence. The mountains offered some protection, and the rivers could be both a blessing and a barrier, but ultimately, the land's greatest vulnerability lay in its location and the divided loyalties of those who sought to rule it. It is within this delicate, dangerous world that we find the beginnings of Vlad III's story, a story that would grow into legend and infamy, whispered in fear and respect across centuries. Before the tales of stakes and rivers of blood, before the rumors of drinking the blood of his enemies and feasting among the dying, there was simply a land fragile and fiercely contested, striving to protect itself from the tides of empires that threatened to swallow it whole. Wallachia, with its rolling hills and dark forests, with its rivers glinting in the sunlight and its people quietly enduring, was the cradle of a prince who would one day be known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. It was a land that taught him the harsh realities of power and survival, a land that demanded strength from those who wished to rule it, and a land that would shape the shadows of a legend that would outlive the crumbling fortresses and silent battlefields of its time. And as we drift deeper into this story, we will continue to walk the roads of Wallachia as they were in Vlad's time, listening to the murmurs of history that still cling to the stones and the trees, preparing to witness how the land itself forged the path of the prince who would leave a trail of 20,000 bodies and more in his wake, a prince whose story would become forever entwined with the darkness followed him. As dawn fades into the soft gray of morning, the world of Wallachia slowly stirs. Fires are stoked, and the scent of wood smoke drifts through the narrow lanes of villages, mingling with the crisp air of the Carpathian foothills. Chickens scratch at the cold earth, and the muffled sounds of cattle echo in wooden pens as the people prepare for another day of labor, prayers, and quiet endurance. In the dim candlelight of castles and wooden manors, the boyars rise, cautious of every shadow that flickers against the walls, aware that the politics of the land are as shifting and dangerous as the mists that roll over the rivers at dawn. These were the mornings into which Vlad II, later known as Vlad Dracula, would rise, a prince and a warrior, a father and a player in the ceaseless games of power that defined the survival of Wallachia. Vlad Dracula was born into a world of fragile alliances and hidden daggers, into a family line that traced its roots through the noble houses of Wallachia and beyond, into the traditions of Eastern Europe's warrior princes. It was a time when the honor of a family was often measured by its ability to defend its lands, to form alliances with powerful neighbors, and to navigate the treacherous waters of shifting political tides. In the year 1431, in the fortress town of Sighisoara, Transylvania, Vlad II was inducted into a society that promised both prestige and responsibility, the Order of the Dragon. This order, founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund in 1408, was dedicated to the defense of Christianity in Eastern Europe, especially against the growing power of the Ottoman Empire that pressed ever closer against the borders of Christendom. The Order of the Dragon was more than a brotherhood of knights. It was a pledge, a bond sealed by oaths to defend the faith and to stand against the advance of those who threatened to extinguish it. Members of the Order wore the emblem of the dragon, coiled and ready to strike, often depicted with a cross upon its back, a symbol of their faith and their readiness to shed blood in its defense. It was a symbol that inspired fear and respect, a promise that the bearer would not yield easily to the forces of darkness that seemed to gather at the edges of their lands. For Vlad Dracula, joining the Order of the Dragon was both an honor and a necessity. Wallachia, caught between Hungary to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south, needed strong leaders who could navigate alliances with Hungary while managing the delicate dance of paying tribute to the Ottomans to avoid destruction. The balance was as thin as a blade's edge, and failure to maintain it could mean ruin not just for the ruler, but for the entire land. The name Dracula itself comes from the word Draco, the Latin word for dragon, and it would become both a badge of honor and a heavy burden for Vlad Dracula and his sons. For in the minds of the people, legends and faith often intertwined, and the dragon, once a symbol of power and protection, would eventually merge with the darker stories that would follow the family through the centuries. In the flicker of candlelight, as the banners of the dragon swayed in the halls of stone castles, alliances were forged in whispered conversations, sealed with handshakes and oaths sworn over wine and the crackle of hearth fires. Vlad Dracula, like many of his time, understood that survival meant knowing when to stand firm and when to bend, when to show strength and when to offer tribute to the Sultan whose armies could cross the Danube in days and lay waste to the fertile fields of Wallachia. The world outside the halls of power did not remain untouched by these alliances. Taxes were raised to pay for tribute, soldiers were gathered to defend the borders, and the people of Wallachia, ever resilient, adjusted to the constant fluctuations of their reality. They whispered prayers in the darkness, hoping that their prince would make the right choices, that he would keep the Ottoman horsemen from burning their homes and taking their children as tribute for the Janissary ranks. Vlad Dracula, as ruler of Wallachia, often found himself in the unenviable position of balancing the demands of the Hungarian crown with those of the Ottoman Sultan. To refuse the Ottomans could mean immediate war, but to defy Hungary would leave Wallachia vulnerable from the north. This constant pressure shaped the politics of the land, creating an environment where trust was a rare commodity and where betrayal could come from even the closest allies. In this world of shifting alliances and hidden threats, the symbolism of the dragon became a beacon of hope for some and a warning to others. For the people, it was a sign that their prince was aligned with the defenders of Christendom, that he was ready to stand against the darkness. For the enemies of Wallachia, it was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even a small principality like Wallachia would not fall easily. But the dragon, for all its promise of protection, could not shield Vlad Dracula from the realities of power. The boyars, the powerful noble families of Wallachia, held their own ambitions, and their support was often conditional, swayed by bribes, threats, or the promise of a new ruler who might better serve their interests. Vlad Dracula had to navigate these treacherous waters carefully, seeking to secure his position while keeping the boyars in check, a task that would eventually cost him dearly. In the flickering torchlight of council meetings, voices would rise in argument, and whispers would carry rumors of conspiracies down the stone halls. The balance of power was delicate, and alliances were often sealed with marriages, promises of land, and the granting of titles, all tools in the arsenal of a ruler who sought to maintain control in a land that rarely allowed for peace. The Order of the Dragon, in its grand halls and solemn ceremonies, promised unity and strength, but on the fields of Wallachia, where armies gathered and banners flapped in the cold wind, the reality was far more complicated. The Ottoman threat loomed large, and the kings of Hungary, preoccupied with their own struggles, often provided only conditional support, expecting Wallachia to serve as a buffer state, absorbing the first waves of Ottoman aggression. Vlad Dracula, as a member of the Order, carried the responsibility of defending his faith and his people. But he also understood the limits of his power. Tribute had to be paid, alliances had to be made, and sometimes, to protect the greater good, compromises had to be accepted, even if they meant dealing with the very forces that threatened to consume his land. And so, as the winds blew through the valleys of Wallachia and the rivers carried the reflections of the moon across their rippling surfaces, Vlad Dracula ruled, carrying the weight of the dragon upon his shoulders, striving to keep his land safe in a world that allowed little room for error. His choices, his alliances, and his compromises would shape the path of his family and his land, setting the stage for the story of his son, Vlad III, who would one day be known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. The boy who would become Dracula, the prince of blood and stakes, grew up under the shadow of the dragon, watching his father navigate the treacherous waters of politics, witnessing the delicate dance between tribute and defiance, between survival and honor. It was a world that taught harsh lessons, where the lines between good and evil were often blurred, and where the roar of the dragon could just as easily herald salvation as it could destruction. In the stillness of the night, the stories of Vlad Dracula and the Order of the Dragon remain, whispered in the winds that pass through the ruins of old fortresses and in the rustle of leaves in the forests that once hid soldiers and refugees alike. They are stories of courage and compromise, of faith and fear, of a land that demanded strength from those who would rule it, and of a father whose choices would shape the destiny of his son, who would carry the name Dracula into legend. As we continue this journey through the shadows of Wallachia, let us remember that before the forests of stakes and the rivers of blood, before the whispered tales of a prince who drank the blood of his enemies, there was a dragon coiled and watchful, a promise of protection and a symbol of defiance, carried by a man who sought to protect his land in a world that offered no mercy. This was the world of Vlad Dracula and the Order of the Dragon, the world that would give rise to a legend that would echo through the centuries, leaving its mark on the stones, the rivers, and the memories of those who still walk the land where the dragon once roared. In the soft quiet of twilight, when the sky deepens into the colors of ash and wine, the world seems to slow, as if holding its breath, listening to the final whispers of the day before night fully claims the valleys of Wallachia. It is in this hush that we turn our eyes to the young Vlad, still a boy, yet already touched by the sharp edges of power and the restless shadows that loomed over his family's rule. The boy who would become Vlad the Impaler was not born in stillness, nor did he grow up in the safety of a peaceful court where laughter echoed and the future seemed certain. Instead, he was born into a world of uncertainty, where every alliance was a fragile thread and every promise carried the weight of 100 unspoken threats. His father, Vlad Dracula, had to navigate the treacherous balance of paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan while maintaining allegiance to Hungary, a tightrope walked over the chasm of potential invasion. In 1442, when Vlad was around 11 years old, the delicate balance that kept Wallachia breathing began to tremble. The Ottoman Empire, under the firm gaze of Sultan Murad II, demanded more from its vassals, and the sands of alliances began to shift once again. To secure his throne and the safety of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula agreed to send his young sons, Vlad and Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman court, a common practice designed to ensure loyalty and compliance. Imagine for a moment the cold dawn when Vlad, a child, was taken from his home, from the misty forests and the familiar paths of his land, to be led down roads lined with watchful trees and toward the banks of the Danube, where the river caught the pale light of morning like liquid silver. His younger brother Radu was with him, the two boys riding under the watchful eyes of Ottoman escorts, leaving behind the sounds of roosters and the sigh of wind through the pine forests for the distant, unknown world of Edirne, the Ottoman capital at the time. For a boy of 11, the journey itself would have felt endless, the days blending together as the landscape changed, from the rolling hills of Wallachia to the flat plains of Thrace, where the air smelled different and the wind carried the calls of birds they had never heard before. They passed through towns where the languages shifted, where the faces around them changed, and where the signs of Ottoman power became more evident with each mile. Minarets rising above the rooftops, markets filled with spices and silk, soldiers in uniforms bearing the crescent moon. When they arrived at the court of the Sultan, the world would have felt like a tapestry of color and noise, a stark contrast to the forests they had known. The Ottoman court was a place of discipline and grandeur, where the wealth of the empire was displayed in the gold and jewels that adorned robes, in the scent of incense that lingered in the corridors, and in the silent power of the soldiers who guarded its halls. But for Vlad and Radu, this court was not a place of wonder. It was a gilded prison. Though they were treated according to their rank as the sons of a voivode, they were still hostages, their lives tied to the will of the Sultan, their safety dependent on the actions of their father. Each letter that arrived from Wallachia would have been met with held breath, each rumor of rebellion or betrayal a shadow that passed over their young faces as they wondered if it would be the day their fortunes changed, if it would be the day they paid for the choices of their family. In the gardens of the Ottoman palace, where the scent of roses and the hum of fountains filled the air, Vlad would have walked with his brother. Their conversations whispered in the language of their homeland, eyes darting around as they wondered which servant might understand, which guard might be listening. They would have learned the customs of the court, observed the prayers called out 5 times a day from the minarets, and seen the training of the janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire, many of whom had once been children taken from their homes, raised to serve the Sultan with unwavering loyalty. These years in captivity were formative for Vlad. He witnessed the discipline of the Ottomans, the efficiency of their administration, and the unwavering authority of the Sultan, whose decisions could determine the fate of kingdoms. It was here, far from home, that Vlad learned the value of power and fear, of control and the price of defiance. He saw how the Ottomans maintained order not only through wealth and administration, but also through the unspoken threat of swift and decisive punishment. While Vlad struggled with his captivity, his brother Radu adapted to life at the Ottoman court. Radu, who would later be known as Radu the Handsome, found favor with the Sultan and became comfortable in the rhythms of Ottoman life, aligning himself with the empire that held them. This difference between the brothers would echo in their futures, shaping the choices they made and the paths they would take when they returned to the world outside the palace walls. For Vlad, captivity was a constant reminder of his family's weakness, a lesson carved into the long days spent away from home. He would have remembered the weight of his father's decisions, the reality that alliances were fragile, and that survival often required sacrifices that could haunt a family for generations. The child who arrived at the Ottoman court with questions in his eyes would leave with the hardened resolve of someone who had seen the machinery of empire up close, and who had learned that respect was often forged in fear. The records of these years are fragmented, filtered through the biases of chroniclers who came after, but the essence remains. Vlad spent several years in the custody of the Ottomans, absorbing the lessons of power, authority, and discipline that would later shape his reign. When he eventually returned to Wallachia, it was not as the boy who had left, but as a young man who understood the weight of power and the methods required to keep it. In the quiet moments of the night, when the winds rustle through the leaves outside, one might imagine young Vlad lying awake in his chambers in Edirne, the distant call of the muezzin drifting through the window, the scent of foreign flowers carried on the breeze, his mind filled with the images of his homeland. The forests of Wallachia, the mountains rising against the horizon, the rivers glinting in the sun, and the faces of the people he had left behind would have lived in his memory, becoming both a comfort and a burden as he wondered if he would ever return, and what he would find if he did. Perhaps he made promises to himself in those quiet hours, promises about what he would do if he ever ruled, about how he would protect his land from the threats that surrounded it, and how he would never again allow his family to be placed in such a position of weakness. These were the seeds of the man who would become Vlad the Impaler, the prince who would be both feared and revered, whose methods would be questioned, but whose determination to secure his land would never be in doubt. The years as a hostage were not just a period of waiting. They were a crucible that shaped Vlad's understanding of the world. He saw firsthand how empires enforced their will, how fear could be wielded as a tool of governance, and how discipline could hold vast territories together. These lessons would travel with him when he returned to Wallachia, woven into the fabric of his rule, emerging in the harsh decisions he would make, in the methods he would use to maintain order, and in the fear that his name would inspire. And so, in the tapestry of Vlad's life, these years in captivity form a dark yet vital thread, a period that transformed a child of Wallachia into a future ruler who would one day paint the roads of his homeland with the stark message that power must be respected, and that betrayal and weakness would not be tolerated. In the shadows of the Ottoman court, amidst the gardens and the prayers, amidst the silent halls where decisions were made, Vlad learned the lessons of authority that would one day make him a legend, both feared and remembered. As we continue to walk through the fog-shrouded paths of this history, let us remember that before the stakes, before the rivers of blood, there was a boy who became a prisoner to protect his homeland, a boy who learned the hard lessons of power in the heart of an empire, and who would one day return to his land with the fire of those lessons burning quietly within him, ready to carve his name into the memory of history forever. As the long nights draped their dark veil over Wallachia, the forests whispered softly in the cold winds, and the stars blinked like watchful eyes across the black canvas of the sky. In those moments when the world was quiet, the lessons of power and betrayal drifted like mist, weaving into the fabric of every noble family, every peasant's prayer, and every decision made within the flickering light of a castle hall. For the young Vlad, still holding in his heart the sights and sounds of the Ottoman court where he spent his formative years as a hostage, these lessons would become the pillars of his future rule, carved not from books or gentle counsel, but from survival itself. When Vlad returned to Wallachia after his years in Ottoman captivity, he returned to a land that had not grown gentler in his absence. The hills and forests were the same, but the people's eyes were wary, carrying the weight of years spent under the tension of shifting allegiances and the threat of invasion. Villagers tended their fields and animals with quiet diligence, but always they listened for the distant sound of hooves on the road, wondering if it would be a tax collector demanding more than they could give, or soldiers sent to fight in a conflict not of their choosing. Vlad returned to find his father, Vlad Dracula, embroiled in the ceaseless dance of Wallachian politics, attempting to balance the demands of the Ottoman Empire and the expectations of the Hungarian crown while managing the ever-restless boyars, the noble families whose support could secure a prince's rule, or tear it down in a single night. It was a fragile dance, one that required a careful step, a measured hand, and a readiness to show strength when strength was needed. But even the measured steps of Vlad Dracula could not save him from the currents of betrayal that flowed through the veins of Wallachian politics. In 1447, when Vlad was around 16 years old, betrayal struck close, leaving wounds that would never truly heal. John Hunyadi, the powerful regent of Hungary, moved against Vlad Dracula, seeing his attempts to maintain peace with the Ottomans as a betrayal of Christendom's fight against the advancing empire. Hunyadi, seeking to secure Hungarian interests in the region, allied with the Wallachian boyars who opposed Vlad Dracula's rule. The details of that betrayal have been softened and sharpened by the years, depending on who tells the story, but the essence remains. Vlad Dracula and his eldest son Mircea were captured. Vlad Dracula was executed, likely by decapitation, and Mircea was reportedly blinded with hot irons before being buried alive in the cold Wallachian earth. The boyars, in their fine garments and whispered alliances, had turned against their voivode, replacing him with another puppet to suit Hungarian interests, ensuring their own power while sacrificing the stability of the land they claimed to protect. For Vlad, the news of his father's death and his brother's horrific execution was not just a personal tragedy, it was a revelation. The lesson was carved deeply into his mind. Power was never secure, trust was a dangerous luxury, and betrayal could come from those who once pledged loyalty with smiles and bows. It was a moment that changed him, a moment that transformed the boy into a young man who would no longer look at alliances with naive hope, but with the cold calculation necessary for survival. The forests of Wallachia, which had once seemed protective, now whispered reminders of the graves that held the bones of the betrayed. The cold wind carrying the lesson that rule required more than noble intentions and whispered prayers. It required the iron will to command, the sharpness to sense betrayal before it struck, and the ruthlessness to act when needed, no matter how cold the decision might be. These early lessons shaped Vlad's view of leadership, justice, and fear. He learned that justice was often a fragile shield, easily shattered by ambition and greed. He saw that the boyars, despite their wealth and position, were driven by their own interests, ready to shift loyalties to protect their power. And he learned that fear could be a more reliable tool than friendship in ensuring obedience in a land where alliances were as fleeting as the morning mist. It was not just the betrayal of the boyars that etched this lesson into Vlad's soul, but the realization that his father's attempts at diplomacy, his efforts to maintain peace through tribute and negotiation, had not saved him. The Ottomans, despite receiving tribute, continued to demand more, and Hungary, despite claiming to protect Christendom, was willing to turn on its allies to serve its own interests. Vlad saw the hypocrisy in the pledges of kings and the promises of nobles, and from this hypocrisy, he learned that survival required strength untempered by hesitation. The years that followed were a test of these lessons. Vlad found himself caught between the Ottomans and the Hungarians, the boyars and their conspiracies, and the constant threat of war. Each decision he made was weighed against the memory of his father's fate, each alliance considered through the lens of betrayal, and each act of power executed with the understanding that weakness would invite the same end that had befallen his family. The roads of Wallachia, lined with ancient trees and the footprints of generations, became the silent witnesses to Vlad's transformation. He rode along these roads, passing villages where people paused in their work to bow in respect, their eyes reflecting both hope and fear as they watched their new prince pass. Children peeked from behind fences, mothers pulling them back gently, whispering prayers that this prince would bring stability, that the storms of war and betrayal would not claim more lives. In the evenings, when the fires in the castles burned low and the halls grew quiet, Vlad would remember the soft voices of the Ottoman court, the discipline of the Janissaries, and the sharpness of power that had been displayed before him in the empire's halls. He would remember the screams he never heard but could imagine, of his brother buried alive, of his father betrayed and executed, and he would sit in the flickering light, his mind calculating the steps he needed to take to avoid the same fate. He knew that to rule Wallachia was to walk on a blade, with enemies on all sides and treachery often disguised in the smiles of supposed allies. He learned to watch carefully, to question every promise, and to trust only in the strength he could wield with his own hands. The lessons of betrayal and survival became the framework upon which he would build his rule, ensuring that he would not fall victim to the same fate as his father. The forests of Wallachia, silent under the moonlight, seemed to echo these lessons, the wind rustling through the branches like a soft reminder of the past. The rivers that cut through the land, reflecting the pale light of the stars, carried the stories of those who had ruled before, of their successes and their failures, of the moments when hesitation had cost them their thrones and their lives. As Vlad prepared for his future, these early lessons became his armor. He understood that fear could secure loyalty where promises could not, that justice needed to be enforced with unwavering firmness, and that the price of weakness was too high for a ruler who wished to keep his throne and protect his land. In the years to come, these lessons would manifest in the methods that made him infamous. The forests of stakes, the swift and brutal punishments, the iron control over the boyars, and the unflinching resolve to defend Wallachia against both internal betrayal and external threats. Each act of harsh justice, each decision to wield fear as a tool, was rooted in the memory of what betrayal had cost his family, in the knowledge that power without strength was a fragile illusion. As we close this segment and prepare to step deeper into the shadowed paths of Vlad's reign, let us carry these lessons with us, understanding that the prince who would become Vlad the Impaler was not born into cruelty, but was shaped by the relentless demands of survival in a land where betrayal could bloom in every shadow, and where the silence of the forests was filled with the whispers of power, fear, and the cold resolve needed to rule. And so, in the hush of the night, as the soft winds pass over the hills of Wallachia, we remember that before the rivers of blood and the legends of Dracula, there was a young man who learned the harshest truths of leadership. A prince who saw betrayal claim his family and vowed that he would never allow the same weakness to claim him. A prince who would one day transform those early lessons into the actions that would forever carve his name into the dark annals of history. Part 2. The Bloody Road to the Throne. The dawn that broke over Wallachia in the year 1448 was quiet, the pale light of morning slipping over the frost-tipped grass and the dark forests that stretched toward the mountains. It was a land still breathing under the weight of uncertainty, with the ashes of old conflicts settling into the soil, while the winds that swept through the valleys carried whispers of what was yet to come. Among those whispers was the return of a young prince who had once left these lands as a hostage, whose eyes had seen the cold halls of Ottoman power, and whose heart had felt the sting of betrayal that tore his family apart. Vlad, the son of Vlad Dracula, returned to Wallachia not as a child, but as a young man forged in the fires of survival, carrying with him the lessons of power and fear learned during his years away. His return was not marked by parades or cheers from the people, for Wallachia was a land wary of princes and the promises they carried. It was a land that had seen too many leaders rise and fall, too many banners change in the cold winds, and too many promises of peace drowned beneath the iron hooves of foreign armies. The people watched from the doorways of their cottages, their eyes cautious, as Vlad and his small retinue moved along the dirt roads, the clatter of hooves mingling with the soft rustle of the forest leaves. Vlad's claim to the throne was not a simple inheritance, it was a battlefield. Wallachia, caught between the ambitions of Hungary and the demands of the Ottoman Empire, was a chessboard where every move was shadowed by suspicion, and every alliance was a risk that could cost a life, a family, or an entire kingdom. Vlad knew this well, and he stepped into this world of shifting loyalties and hidden daggers with the resolve of someone who understood that power was not given. It was taken, held, and defended with unwavering determination. In October 1448, with Ottoman support, Vlad made his first attempt to claim the Wallachian throne. The throne at that time was occupied by Vladislav II, supported by the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, the same Hunyadi whose actions had contributed to the death of Vlad's father and brother. It was not only a political claim for Vlad, it was personal, a step toward reclaiming the honor of his family and asserting the strength that he believed was necessary to rule a land as restless as Wallachia. The initial attempt was brief. Vlad held the throne for only a few months before Hunyadi returned from a failed campaign against the Ottomans and forced him to flee. Yet even in this short time, Vlad began to understand the true nature of ruling Wallachia. He saw the suspicion in the eyes of the boyars, who had grown accustomed to shifting their loyalties to protect their own interests. He saw the fear of the peasants, who lived under the constant threat of raids and heavy taxation, their lives caught between the demands of their rulers and the dangers of the world beyond their villages. The cold winds that swept through the forests seemed to echo the uncertainty of the land, carrying with them the sounds of distant battles and the cries of those who had fallen in the endless struggles for power. For Vlad, the brief taste of authority was enough to solidify his resolve. He saw clearly that to rule Wallachia, to protect it from the vultures that circled its borders and the traitors who plotted within, he would need to wield power with a firm hand, unyielding and decisive. Over the next several years, Vlad lived in exile, moving through the courts of Moldavia and Transylvania, gathering allies and waiting for the moment when he could return to Wallachia to claim what he believed was rightfully his. These years were spent in careful observation, learning the art of alliances and the dangers of trust, understanding the intricate web of politics that connected the kingdoms and empires of Eastern Europe. The people of Wallachia continued their lives during these years, tending to their fields under the changing skies, gathering around fires in the cold evenings to share stories of old heroes and lost kings, and listening for rumors of who might next claim the throne. They had seen many princes come and go, some with promises of peace, others with the threat of war, and all with the demand for loyalty that was often tested by the shifting winds of power. In 1456, the winds shifted once more in Vlad's favor. With the support of Hungarian forces under Hunyadi, who had now found common cause with Vlad against the Ottoman threat, Vlad returned to Wallachia, prepared to claim the throne once again. This time, the claim was not just a test but a commitment, a promise to rule with the strength he believed was necessary to bring stability to a land that had known too little of it. The battle for the throne was fierce, with Vlad confronting and defeating Vladislav II in a duel or battle near Targovist, depending on the chroniclers of the time. The details of the confrontation are blurred by the passage of time, but the result was clear. Vlad emerged as the voivode of Wallachia, and the road forward would be carved by his decisions, his methods, and the iron will that had been forged in the shadows of betrayal and captivity. The people of Wallachia, weary from the turmoil of constant leadership changes, looked to their new prince with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that he might bring stability to the land, protect them from the raids of foreign armies, and control the ambitions of the boyars who often placed their own wealth above the well-being of the people. Fear, because they sensed in Vlad a resolve that was unyielding, a coldness that promised justice, but also demanded obedience without question. Vlad, standing in the halls of Targovist, the seat of Wallachian power, would have looked upon the banners of his ancestors and the worn stones of the fortress with a quiet determination. The air would have been thick with the scent of burning torches, the shadows dancing along the walls as he considered the steps he would need to take to secure his rule. He knew the boyars who pledged loyalty did so with caution, ready to shift allegiance if it served their interests, and he knew the Ottomans watched from the south, while Hungary eyed the land from the north, each waiting to see if this new prince would bend to their will or defy their demands. In the markets of Targovist, where traders sold their goods under the watchful eyes of soldiers, the whispers of the people carried news of the new prince. They spoke of the young man who had returned from exile, of the rumors that he had seen the cruelty of the Ottomans and learned their methods, and of the stories that he would rule with justice that was swift and severe, determined to bring order to a land that had suffered too long under chaos and betrayal. Children, playing along the dusty roads, paused to watch the riders who carried messages for the prince, their eyes wide as they imagined the life of a ruler, unaware of the weight that rested on Vlad's shoulders. Mothers pulled their children back, whispering prayers that this prince might be the one to bring them peace, to protect their homes from the flames of war, and to allow them to live their simple lives in safety. The rivers of Wallachia, flowing quietly under the pale light of the moon, carried reflections of the stars as they made their way toward the Danube. And in their silent journey, they mirrored the quiet hopes of the people, their prayers that the tides of power would not sweep them away once again. For Vlad, the return to Wallachia and the claiming of the throne was not the end of his quest, but the beginning of a chapter that would define him in the annals of history. It was the moment when he stepped fully into the role of ruler, carrying with him the lessons of betrayal, the knowledge of power, and the determination to enforce the stability he believed was necessary, even if it required methods that would be remembered in fear for centuries. As we leave this segment, let us remember the quiet roads of Wallachia under the dawn sky, the soft sounds of the forests that watched as a young prince returned to claim his destiny, and the silent promises made by a ruler who believed that only through strength could the land find peace. This was the beginning of Vlad's reign, a reign that would carve his name into the stones of history, into the whispers of the people, and into the legends that would echo long after the torches of his court had burned out. The winds that curled through the narrow streets of Targovist carried with them the scent of wood smoke and earth, rustling the cloaks of merchants and stirring the quiet conversations of villagers as they went about their daily routines. In the distance, the bells of the church rang softly, a reminder of prayers lifted to the sky each dawn, asking for peace, for protection, and for the promise of a season free from the shadow of war. Yet even as these prayers rose, the people of Wallachia felt the presence of their new voivode, Vlad, settling over the land like the silent weight of winter clouds. He was a ruler who watched carefully, whose eyes missed little, and whose mind, sharpened by betrayal and captivity, understood that promises alone could not bring stability to a kingdom as restless as Wallachia. In the months following his return to power, Vlad began to implement policies that would forever define his rule in the memories of his people. Policies rooted in the firm belief that corruption was a poison that weakened the spirit of the land and drained the strength of its people. He had seen how the boyars, wrapped in fine garments and hidden behind polite words, shifted their loyalties to protect their wealth and privilege. He had seen how merchants, emboldened by years of weak rulers, manipulated trade and taxes to line their pockets while peasants struggled to keep bread on their tables. Vlad believed that to protect Wallachia from the vultures that circled it from abroad, it first had to be protected from the wolves that prowled within. And so, he ruled with a justice that was swift, cold, and terrifying, using fear as both a shield and a sword to cut away the rot that threatened his kingdom. Stories spread through the markets and along the roads, carried in whispers by travelers and merchants, of how Vlad summoned the boyars to his court, questioning them about their loyalties and the roles they had played in the betrayal that led to his father's death. In one of the most remembered acts, it is said that he gathered the boyars for a feast, welcoming them with warmth and courtesy, only to have them seized and impaled or forced into hard labor, building the fortifications and roads that would strengthen Wallachia's defenses. To Vlad, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a necessary cleansing, a removal of those who had proven that their ambitions were worth more to them than the stability of the land they claimed to serve. In his eyes, a kingdom could not survive if those who advised and ruled alongside him were the same who would betray him when it suited their interests. Beyond the boyars, Vlad turned his eyes toward the merchants and thieves who took advantage of the chaos that often followed shifts in power. The roads of Wallachia were known to be dangerous, plagued by bandits who preyed upon travelers and merchants, and by corrupt officials who extorted bribes from those seeking to move their goods from one market to another. Trade, so vital to the lifeblood of Wallachia, was stifled by the fear that no protection would be found on the roads, and that justice was only a word spoken in church, not enforced in the streets. Vlad sought to change this, believing that the fear of punishment was the surest guard against corruption. Tales are told of Vlad's decree that a golden cup would be placed at the well in Targovist, free for any traveler or villager to use for water, a silent test to see if anyone would dare steal it. The cup remained untouched, a gleaming symbol of the new order under Vlad's rule, where theft would not be tolerated, and where justice was no longer delayed by bureaucracy or bribery. His methods were harsh, but they were effective. Bandits who once stalked the roads found themselves hunted, and those caught were often impaled along the roads they had once used to ambush the helpless. Officials who accepted bribes or overstepped their duties found their positions, and sometimes their lives, ended swiftly, their punishments displayed publicly as warnings to others. For the peasants and honest merchants, there was a strange sense of relief that settled over the land. mixed with the fear that came from knowing the price of disobedience. Travelers could move along the roads without the same fear of robbery, and the markets began to see a steadier flow of goods, as the merchants learned that fairness in trade was no longer optional under the watch of the voivode. At night, in the warmth of their cottages, families would speak softly of the changes they saw. They would speak of how the roads were safer, how the taxes were collected but with clear order, and how the fear of bandits had begun to fade like a bad dream. Yet they would also speak with caution, aware that the justice that protected them came with the price of fear, and that those who tested the resolve of their prince often paid with their lives. Vlad's vision of justice was uncompromising. To him, corruption was not merely an inconvenience, but a betrayal of the people and the stability of Wallachia. He had seen how empires wielded fear to maintain order, and he believed that Wallachia, fragile and threatened from within and without, could only survive if its people understood that justice would be enforced with a firmness that would not bend under pressure. The forests that lined the roads, dark and ancient, became silent witnesses to this new order, as the bodies of criminals and traitors were left impaled, a grim warning that echoed with each creak of the branches in the cold wind. To travelers, the sight was a reminder that Vlad's justice was not hidden behind courtly process, but was as clear and direct as the winter sky. And so, the people of Wallachia lived under a ruler who promised order and delivered it, a ruler whose methods would be remembered with fear and, in some quiet corners, with gratitude. For in a land where chaos had often reigned, and where betrayal had claimed many princes before him, Vlad's firm hand brought a stability that allowed the fields to be sown and harvested, the markets to thrive, and the roads to carry the steps of travelers and traders safely under the watchful gaze of their voivode. As the moon rose over Wallachia, casting its pale light over the rivers and forests, the people would look to the horizon, wondering what the future would bring, knowing that for now, the land was secure under a ruler who believed that fear, tempered by justice, was the surest path to the survival of their fragile homeland. And in the silence of those nights, the winds that passed over the land would carry the unspoken truth that Vlad's anti-corruption policies, harsh as they were born not from a desire for cruelty, but from a desperate need to protect a land he believed was worth any sacrifice to defend. In the stillness of early dawn, when the mist rises from the rivers and drapes itself softly over the forests of Wallachia, the roads are silent, waiting for footsteps and wagon wheels to carve lines in the damp earth. Yet along some of these roads, beneath the bending branches and under the pale sky, there once stood rows of tall, sharpened stakes, each bearing the weight of a human body, swaying gently in the wind, their presence heavy with warning. These were the forests of stakes, the grim signature of Vlad III, known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. To the people who lived in Wallachia, these stakes were both a horror and a promise, a testament to the brutal reality of their ruler's justice, and a reminder that the roads, for now, were safe from the hands of thieves and the whispers of traitors. Impalement was not an invention of Vlad's. It was a method of execution used by empires before him, including the Ottomans, who employed it to instill fear and assert control. Vlad, having seen the power of fear during his captivity, recognized it not only as a punishment, but as a message, a language spoken in silence that even the most stubborn traitors would understand. To many, the image of impalement is difficult to comprehend fully. It was a death that was slow, painful, and public, intended not just to end a life, but to display the consequence of disobedience. The condemned would be placed upon a stake sharpened at one end, the point carefully oiled or rounded to prolong suffering, and then the stake would be raised upright, leaving the victim to suffer for hours, sometimes days, before death would finally come. Ottoman and Saxon sources claimed that Vlad employed this punishment on a massive scale, with reports ranging from 20,000 to 40,000 people executed during his reign through various methods, with impalement being the most infamous. These numbers, though likely exaggerated by those who wished to demonize him, point to the undeniable fact that Vlad used fear as a tool of governance, wielding it with a precision that ensured his authority was both respected and dreaded. But was this cruelty for cruelty's sake, or was it a deliberate strategy in a land constantly under threat? For Vlad, whose father and brother had fallen to betrayal, whose homeland was squeezed between powerful neighbors ready to exploit any weakness, the message was clear. Loyalty was not optional, and treachery would not be tolerated. The roads of Wallachia, which had once been plagued by bandits and conspirators, became safer under Vlad's rule. Merchants could travel from town to town without the same fear of ambush, and the peasants who walked the narrow paths to market could do so with the knowledge that their ruler, harsh as he was, enforced a form of justice that brought stability to their fragile existence. Yet, for those who saw the stakes lining the roads, the fear was real, sinking into their bones with every glance toward the grim silhouettes against the sky. The stories of entire fields filled with impaled bodies of traitors, criminals, and captured enemies displayed along the borders were passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each telling until they became legends of terror that crossed the borders of Wallachia and reached the ears of foreign rulers. One of the most infamous instances of Vlad's use of impalement was during the Ottoman campaign against him in 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, having crossed the Danube with a massive army to subdue Vlad and bring Wallachia fully under Ottoman control, advanced toward Targovist, only to encounter a horrifying sight. Stretching before him was what chroniclers described as a forest of the impaled. With thousands of Ottoman prisoners and traitors displayed upon stakes, their lifeless bodies swaying gently, the smell of death heavy in the air. The Sultan, a seasoned conqueror who had taken Constantinople itself, was said to have paused at the sight, shaken by the scale and the cold message it carried. Though the Ottomans eventually pressed on, the psychological impact of Vlad's display was undeniable, and it became one of the most retold stories in the chronicles of his reign. To Vlad, this act was not merely about punishment. It was a weapon as powerful as any army, sending a clear message to friend and foe alike that Wallachia was ruled by a prince who would not submit easily, who would not tolerate betrayal within his ranks, and who was prepared to use the harshest measures to protect his land from the encroaching shadows of empires. But the use of impalement also created a legacy that would follow Vlad for centuries. The image of bodies upon stakes became the defining symbol of his rule, overshadowing the complexities of his reign, the context of his choices, and the stability he brought to Wallachia during a time when chaos was often the norm. For some, Vlad was a hero who protected his land with the only means available to him. For others, he was a monster whose cruelty became the foundation for the Dracula legend that would rise long after his death. The truth, as with many figures in history, lies somewhere in the quiet spaces between these extremes. Vlad was a product of his time, a time when rulers were judged not by the softness of their words, but by the strength of their actions, when fear was often the only currency that could buy peace in a land surrounded by threats. In the evenings, as the fires burned in the hearths of Wallachian homes, parents would speak softly to their children of the voivode, who ruled with an iron hand, who kept the roads safe but whose methods were not to be questioned. They would remind them to be honest, to be loyal, to respect the laws, for the stakes that lined the roads were a promise as much as a threat, a promise that justice, however harsh, would find those who betrayed the peace of the land. For the travelers who moved under the pale moonlight, the stakes were markers along their journey, reminders of the prince who watched over the roads even in the silence of the night. Each creak of the branches in the wind, each rustle of leaves, seemed to echo the unspoken promise that betrayal would not be tolerated, that the peace they enjoyed came at a price that was visible to all who passed. And for Vlad, sitting in the halls of his fortress, the candlelight flickering against the cold stone walls, the stakes were not just tools of fear, but symbols of the authority he needed to maintain. The unyielding stance he had to hold to keep Wallachia from falling into the chaos that had claimed his family and that threatened to consume his land. As we close this segment, let us remember that the forests of stakes that once stood in Wallachia were more than a testament to cruelty. They were a reflection of a time when the survival of a kingdom depended on the fear it could inspire in those who would seek to harm it, and when a ruler, determined to protect his people, believed that only through strength and the promise of severe justice could the fragile peace of his land be preserved. In the quiet of the night, when the winds pass over the hills of Wallachia, rustling the grass that grows where stakes once stood, the whispers of history remind us that Vlad's reign was not merely a reign of terror, but a reign of survival, forged in the shadows of betrayal and the harsh reality of a world that demanded strength above all else. As dawn touched the rooftops of Wallachian villages with pale light, the market stirred to life. Merchants unfolded rough-woven cloth to display spices from distant lands, salt harvested from mountain caves, and wool dyed in hues of crimson and indigo. The soft clinking of coins, the low hum of bargaining voices, and the warm scent of freshly baked bread drifted between wooden stalls, weaving a tapestry of daily survival and quiet ambition. But beneath this morning bustle lay tensions older than the roads themselves, tensions of trade, taxes, and the thin line between prosperity and ruin. It was in these markets and along these trade roads that the conflict between Vlad the Impaler and the Saxon merchants of Transylvania would ignite, becoming one of the most defining and blood-soaked episodes of his reign. The Saxons, German settlers in the fortified towns of Transylvania such as Brasov and Sibiu, held considerable economic power. For generations, they managed trade routes that connected Wallachia to the broader markets of Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Their caravans carried salt, iron, textiles, and luxury goods, moving with the authority of merchants who had long enjoyed special privileges: lower taxes, freedom of movement, and the protection of their town's sturdy walls. For the Wallachian peasants and local traders, the Saxons were both a lifeline and a burden. They brought goods that were needed, but their control over prices and routes often pushed local traders to the edges of survival, forcing them to sell cheaply and buy dearly. The boyars, too, watched warily as the Saxons expanded their economic influence into Wallachia, knowing that wealth could translate into power, and that power could challenge even the authority of a voivode. When Vlad returned to the throne, he found himself facing this entrenched Saxon dominance, viewing it not just as an economic inconvenience, but as a direct threat to his fragile authority and to Wallachia's independence. To Vlad, the Saxons were not merely traders. They were a reminder of foreign influence and the privileges that undermined his efforts to centralize power and enforce fair taxation across his realm. The conflict escalated when the Saxons refused to recognize Vlad's authority to tax their merchants in Wallachian territory. The Saxons argued that they had long held the right to trade freely, citing ancient privileges granted by previous rulers and treaties. Vlad, determined to break the cycle of special treatments that weakened his rule, insisted that all who traded within his lands were subject to his laws and taxes, regardless of their heritage or previous arrangements. At first, the conflict was a war of words, of letters sent back and forth, heavy with seals and the polite language of diplomacy, each side asserting its rights and grievances. But in a land where power was enforced by steel more often than by parchment, the situation soon escalated beyond the reach of words. Vlad began to intercept Saxon caravans entering Wallachia, seizing their goods and demanding the taxes he believed were owed. The merchants, indignant and angered, petitioned the leaders of their towns, calling on the princes of Transylvania and the Hungarian crown to intervene. Skirmishes broke out along the trade routes, with Saxon guards clashing with Wallachian patrols, the roads echoing with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. But Vlad's resolve did not waver. For him, this was not just about the silver coins or the crates of spices and cloth. It was about sovereignty, about proving that Wallachia was not a land to be exploited by foreign interests while its own people struggled under the weight of poverty and insecurity. In 1459, the conflict reached its brutal peak. Vlad launched raids against the Saxon towns of Brasov and Sibiu, burning villages and seizing goods, his soldiers moving swiftly and without mercy. Saxon merchants and their families were captured, and in a display that would become infamous, many were impaled outside the towns, their bodies swaying in the cold wind as a stark message to all who defied the authority of Wallachia's prince. Chroniclers of the time, particularly those from the Saxon towns, described these raids in vivid detail, portraying Vlad as a monster who delighted in cruelty for its own sake. They wrote of villages in flames, of mothers clutching their children as they fled, of merchants pleading for mercy as their goods were taken and their homes destroyed. To Vlad's supporters, however, these actions were seen through a different lens. They argued that the Saxons had long exploited Wallachia, hiding behind foreign protection while draining the land of its wealth. Vlad's campaign was, in their eyes, an act of justice, a necessary reclaiming of Wallachian rights against those who had grown too accustomed to treating the land and its people as tools for their profit. In the marketplaces of Targovist, people spoke of these events with a mix of fear and quiet approval. They feared the wrath of their prince, knowing that disobedience could bring swift punishment, but they also saw the trade routes opening to Wallachian merchants, no longer pushed aside by the powerful Saxon guilds. Goods once controlled by foreign traders began to move more freely, and while the fear of violence hung over these gains, there was a sense that, for the first time in a long while, the interests of Wallachians were being defended. The forests along the roads, silent witnesses to the passage of countless caravans, now held the grim reminders of Vlad's resolve. Stakes bearing the bodies of those who defied his decrees, standing tall in the cold dawn, their shadows stretching across the frost-covered ground like warnings etched into the land itself. For the Saxons, the conflict left deep scars, and the stories they carried back to their towns became the seeds of the legends that would one day merge Vlad's name with terror across Europe. In these stories, Vlad was not a prince defending his land. He was a bloodthirsty tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds. These narratives would travel across borders, finding eager ears in courts and cities far from Wallachia, shaping the dark myth that would one day transform Vlad the Impaler into the legendary Dracula. Yet within Wallachia, the narrative was more complex. Vlad's actions, however brutal, brought a form of order that the people could feel in their daily lives. The roads, once dangerous, became safer under the fear of harsh justice. Trade, once dominated by foreign interests, began to include more local merchants, and the message was clear. Wallachia was not to be plundered without consequence. In the evenings, as families gathered around the warmth of their hearths, the flickering light illuminating their faces, parents would speak to their children of the prince who ruled with a firm hand, reminding them that the world was a place of hard choices, and that strength was often the only shield against those who would take advantage of weakness. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the winds swept softly through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of burning wood and the faint salt of tears shed in the dark, the people of Wallachia understood that their land, fragile and fiercely contested, needed a protector who would not flinch when the moment came to defend it. Part 3: Battles against the Ottomans and Vampire Legends. As dawn broke over the dark forests and quiet rivers of Wallachia, the soft mist curling over the fields, the land braced under the weight of a threat far greater than the whispers of local conspiracies or the tensions of trade disputes. For on the horizon loomed the banners of the Ottoman Empire, their crescent moons glinting under the cold sky, carried by the winds that swept over the Danube's waters and into the valleys where the people of Wallachia lived, prayed, and feared. Sultan Mehmed II, known to many as Mehmed the Conqueror, had already carved his name into the history of the world by taking Constantinople in 1453, a feat that shook the courts of Europe and sent ripples of fear through every kingdom that lay in the path of the Ottoman armies. The Sultan was young, ambitious, and relentless, and his gaze now turned toward Wallachia, a land he saw as both a vassal to be controlled and a frontier that could not remain unruly under a prince who would not bow easily. For Vlad III, the voivode of Wallachia, the arrival of Mehmed's ambitions was no surprise. He had spent his youth as a hostage in the Ottoman court, seen the disciplined ranks of the janissaries, smelled the incense of the palace halls, and witnessed the way the Sultan's power stretched over lands and people with quiet authority. He knew the might of the Ottoman war machine, the countless soldiers who marched under the Sultan's command, the cannons that could tear through walls, and the unwavering resolve of Mehmed himself. But Vlad was not a ruler who would yield. His rule had been forged in the fires of betrayal and hardened by the necessity of strength. He had cleansed his lands of corruption and banditry with brutal efficiency, secured the roads for trade under his law, and made clear that loyalty was not a request but a demand. Now, as the threat of Ottoman invasion grew, Vlad prepared to defend his kingdom with the same cold determination that had become his legacy. The conflict escalated in 1462, a year marked by tension and the silent preparations of war. Vlad had refused to pay the tribute demanded by Mehmed II, asserting that Wallachia was not a land to be bought and ruled through gold alone. The Sultan, unwilling to let defiance stand, assembled a massive army, determined to bring Wallachia fully under Ottoman control and to remove the prince who challenged his authority. As the Ottoman forces crossed the Danube, their banners fluttering in the summer breeze, their soldiers marching in steady formation, Vlad knew that direct confrontation would be as dangerous as it was inevitable. His forces were outnumbered, his resources limited compared to the vast wealth and manpower of the Ottoman Empire. But Vlad understood the land, the rivers, the forests, and the mountains of Wallachia as an extension of himself, and he would use them in his defense. Employing guerrilla tactics, Vlad launched a campaign of raids and ambushes, using the forests as cover and the rivers as silent pathways for his soldiers. He struck Ottoman supply lines, attacked small detachments, and harassed the enemy at every opportunity, weakening their morale and sowing fear among their ranks. The Ottomans, accustomed to open-field battles and siege warfare, found themselves in a land where every shadow might conceal a Wallachian blade, and every path could lead to a sudden, vicious assault. The most legendary moment of this resistance came on the night of June 17, 1462, known to history as the Night Attack. Under the cover of darkness, Vlad led a daring assault on the Ottoman camp, seeking to reach Mehmed himself, to strike a blow that would shatter the enemy's resolve. The Wallachian soldiers, moving like shadows under the moonlight, infiltrated the Ottoman camp, setting tents ablaze, cutting down guards, and creating chaos under the cold stars. Fires erupted in the night, illuminating the terrified faces of soldiers who awoke to the screams of the dying and the clash of steel. Horses reared in panic, men stumbled from their tents, the flames reflecting off the blades that cut through the confusion. Vlad's forces moved swiftly, their knowledge of the terrain and the element of surprise giving them an advantage against the larger Ottoman army. Though Vlad did not reach the Sultan's tent that night, the attack achieved its purpose. The Ottomans, shaken by the boldness and ferocity of the assault, suffered significant losses and were forced to retreat temporarily, reassessing their campaign against a prince who fought not with the might of large armies, but with the unyielding will of a ruler defending every tree, every stone, and every river of his homeland. The people of Wallachia, who watched the fires burn in the distance that night, understood the message their prince had sent. It was a message of defiance, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and of a promise that Wallachia would not be surrendered without a fight, even against an empire as powerful as the Ottomans. In the days that followed, the tension remained. The Ottomans continued their campaign, and Vlad continued his resistance, burning fields and villages ahead of the advancing enemy to deny them supplies, using scorched earth tactics that turned the fertile valleys into wastelands that offered no comfort to the invaders. It was a harsh choice, sacrificing the prosperity of his people in the short term, but Vlad believed that survival required these sacrifices. Chroniclers of the time, especially those aligned with the Ottomans or their allies, would later portray Vlad's tactics as ruthless, depicting him as a bloodthirsty leader who brought suffering upon his own people. Yet within Wallachia, among those who understood the threat of Ottoman domination, Vlad's actions were seen as the desperate measures of a prince determined to preserve the independence of his land, even if it meant walking through the ashes of his own villages. In the cool evenings, as the winds swept softly over the rivers and through the forests, the people would speak quietly of the prince who dared to challenge the Sultan, who used the shadows of the night to strike fear into the hearts of an army that had conquered cities and kingdoms far larger than Wallachia. They would remember the glow of the fires during the night attack, the scent of smoke carried by the breeze, and the stories of Ottoman soldiers who spoke of a prince who appeared like a phantom in the dark, leaving death and fear in his wake. For Vlad, the resistance against Mehmed II was not merely a battle for territory. It was a fight for dignity, for the right of Wallachia to exist without the constant weight of foreign demands and the draining tribute that weakened the land. It was a fight born of the lessons he had learned during his captivity, shaped by the betrayal that had claimed his family, and driven by the promise that Wallachia would remain standing, even if the cost was paid in blood and fire. As we close this segment, let us remember that the story of Vlad's resistance against the Ottomans is more than a tale of war. It is a testament to the will of a ruler who understood that sometimes, survival demands courage that is willing to stand against the might of empires, using every shadow, every river, and every forest as a weapon in the quiet, determined defense of a land he would not surrender. In the cool hush of early morning, as the pale light of dawn crept across the fields of Wallachia and mist rose like breath from the rivers, stories also began to stir. Stories that would drift across the hills and into the hearth-lit homes of peasants, travel with traders down muddy roads, and eventually cross mountains and seas to echo in the courts of Europe. Stories about Vlad. Stories of how he fought invaders in the dark, how he cleansed his land with fire and fear, and how the roads were lined with the bodies of the impaled. Yet among these stories were darker whispers, ones that lingered longer in the minds of those who heard them. That Vlad did not simply punish his enemies with death, but feasted among their corpses, dipped bread into their blood, and drank from the wounds of the dying. Such rumors, chilling as the mists that swept across the Danube, began during Vlad's lifetime and grew louder with each retelling, transforming him from a harsh ruler into something monstrous, something inhuman, feeding the fear that would one day birth the legend of Dracula. The Saxon merchants, who had felt the sharp edge of Vlad's justice during their conflicts with him, were among the first to record these rumors in printed pamphlets and chronicles, their words heavy with horror and condemnation. These pamphlets, printed in Germany and distributed widely, described Vlad not only as a cruel ruler, but as a demon among men, a creature who delighted in blood and suffering, who found pleasure in the agony of others. One such story claimed that Vlad would dine in the shadow of his victims, their bodies impaled on stakes surrounding him as he took his meals, their groans mixing with the crackle of the fire and the rustle of the cold wind. It was said that he would raise a cup to his lips, filled with the blood of those he had executed, and drink deeply as he watched the life fade from their eyes. These accounts told of a ruler who invited guests to his table, only to have them seized and executed before him, their bodies added to the forest of stakes as he continued to eat, unbothered, the blood of the dying staining the earth around him. Chroniclers described this scene with breathless horror, painting a picture of a man who found beauty in suffering and power in the fear of those who witnessed his deeds. But were these stories true? The reality, as it often is in history, is layered and uncertain. While there is no definitive evidence that Vlad truly drank the blood of his victims or feasted among their dying bodies, the power of such stories lay not in their truth, but in their ability to shape perception. For Vlad's enemies, especially the Saxons, these rumors were tools, transforming a political and economic conflict into a moral crusade against a ruler portrayed as inhuman, a beast in human form who needed to be defeated for the safety of Christendom. And yet, the environment in which these rumors thrived was one where the brutal realities of medieval warfare and punishment were not uncommon. Executions were public spectacles, and the bodies of the executed were often displayed as warnings. Rulers across Europe used fear to control their subjects, and the line between justice and cruelty was often thin, shifting with the needs of the moment. Vlad's methods, undeniably harsh, fit into this world, but the scale and theatrical nature of his punishments set him apart. He understood that fear was a weapon as potent as any sword, and that the rumors of his cruelty, once spread, would travel faster and more effectively than any messenger could carry his warnings. Perhaps Vlad himself recognized the power in these stories. Perhaps he allowed them to grow, to take on lives of their own, ensuring that even those who might challenge him would pause, shivering at the thought of facing a ruler who might not only defeat them but consume them in every sense. The forest of stakes, the bodies swaying in the wind, and the rumors of blood drinking and feasting became part of his arsenal, invisible weapons that cut into the hearts of those who heard of them. In Wallachia, the people lived under the shadow of these rumors, balancing fear with the quiet understanding that the roads were safer, the markets more stable, and the fields less likely to be trampled by raiders under Vlad's rule. They may have whispered about the prince who dined among the dead, but they also saw the protection his harshness provided, the stability that allowed them to plant and harvest, to raise their children under a sky that, for a while, did not burn with the fires of war. At night, as families gathered around their hearths, they would tell stories to their children, warning them to obey the laws and to respect the order that kept the wolves at bay. They would lower their voices when they spoke of Vlad, reminding each other that their voivode was not a man to be crossed, that his justice was swift, and that even the wind seemed to carry his gaze across the valleys and forests. For traders and nobles in distant lands, the rumors of Vlad's blood drinking became entertainment as much as cautionary tale, whispered in the halls of castles by candlelight, reinforcing the image of a distant land ruled by a monster. These stories would eventually catch the imagination of writers and poets, transforming Vlad the Impaler into the Dracula of legend, the vampire prince who haunted the Carpathian Mountains, feeding on the blood of the living. Yet within these dark stories, a kernel of reality remained. Vlad was a ruler who understood fear, who wielded it with precision, and who believed that the survival of Wallachia depended on his willingness to do what others would not. Whether he truly drank the blood of his enemies is a question that history may never answer with certainty, but the power of the rumor itself became part of his rule, an echo of terror that protected his land as surely as the stakes that lined his roads. As we close this segment, let us remember that history is often shaped by stories as much as by facts. The image of Vlad dining among the dead, of raising a cup of blood to his lips under the cold stars, may never be proven true, but it became part of the myth that surrounded him, a myth that protected his land through fear and that would one day transform into the legend of Dracula, immortal in the minds of those who heard the whispers carried by the winds of Wallachia. In the soft quiet of the night, when the mist drifts across the fields and the rivers reflect the pale moonlight, the stories of Vlad's rumored feasts still linger in the silence, reminders of a ruler who understood that power sometimes lay in the shadows between truth and fear, shaping a legacy that would outlive the flames of war and the slow decay of time. In the soft, gray hush before dawn, when the mist curls gently over Wallachhia's rivers and the dark forests seem to hold their breath, the world feels timeless. It is in these silent spaces that stories take root, slipping through the cracks of memory and history, weaving themselves into legends that travel further than armies and last longer than kingdoms. Among these legends, one name has echoed across centuries and borders, whispered in fear and fascination: Dracula. But before Dracula was a creature of fangs and capes, before he haunted the pages of Gothic novels or flickered across silver screens, he was a prince, Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, a man of flesh and blood who ruled with an iron hand, whose harshness was born from betrayal, and whose actions were shaped by the relentless need to protect a fragile land caught between empires. How, then, did Vlad the Impaler, a historical ruler defending his realm, transform into Dracula, the immortal vampire of nightmares? The path from history to myth was neither sudden nor simple. It began with stories and pamphlets spread by his enemies. Saxon merchants, who suffered under Vlad's fierce enforcement of taxation and trade control, printed accounts describing him as a monster. These pamphlets, inked with fear and anger, told of a ruler who dined among impaled corpses, who delighted in the suffering of others, who drank blood and bathed in gore. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales crossed borders, landing in the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, where they were devoured by readers eager for stories of distant terrors. The Ottomans, too, carried tales of Vlad's brutality back to their lands, adding to the chorus of fear that surrounded his name. To the Ottoman soldiers who marched under Mehmed II, Vlad was a phantom in the forests, a leader whose tactics were as terrifying as they were effective. The memory of the Forest of the Impaled that greeted Mehmed's forces during the 1462 campaign became a vivid, living nightmare, ensuring that Vlad's reputation was secured among his enemies. Yet it was not only fear that preserved Vlad's memory. In Wallachia and Romania, stories of Vlad carried a different tone. Here, he was seen as a protector, a harsh but necessary ruler who brought order to chaos and defended the land against foreign domination. Mothers would remind their children that the roads were safe under Vlad, that the merchants could trade without fear of bandits, that the fields could be sown and harvested because their prince would not bow to the Ottomans. This duality, hero in one land, monster in another, created the fertile soil in which myth could grow. Centuries later, in the 19th century, Europe found itself in the grip of a fascination with the Gothic, the eerie, and the supernatural. The Romantic era's love for dark forests, misty mountains, and ancient curses created an appetite for stories of creatures that lived in the shadows, of castles perched on cliffs, of beings who defied death itself. Into this cultural landscape stepped Bram Stoker, an Irish author who, in 1897, published Dracula, the novel that would immortalize the name. Stoker's Dracula was a vampire lord, a creature who fed on blood to sustain his immortality, who could command wolves and bats, and who slept in coffins by day to roam by night. He was both alluring and terrifying, an embodiment of the fears and fascinations of Victorian society. Stoker's notes for Dracula reveal that he came across the name Dracula during his research and learned that it meant son of the dragon or son of the devil. He found references to Vlad's reputation for cruelty, the impalements, the fierce resistance against the Ottomans, and the stories of bloodshed. Yet it is important to note that Stoker did not set out to write a biography of Vlad the Impaler. Instead, he borrowed the name and the aura of darkness surrounding it, weaving them into his Gothic tale to lend it an air of authenticity and ancient dread. In Stoker's hands, Vlad the Impaler became Count Dracula, a vampire whose castle loomed over the Carpathians, whose very existence threatened the polite, ordered world of Victorian England. The historical prince who fought the Ottomans became the supernatural predator who crossed the sea to hunt in London's fog-shrouded streets. The connection between Vlad and Dracula, while rooted in historical references, was transformed into legend through the power of storytelling. Over time, the lines blurred, and many began to believe that Vlad himself had been a vampire, that the stories of his supposed blood-drinking were not rumors but truths. Films, plays, and novels expanded upon this myth, shaping the modern image of Dracula into the sharp-fanged, cloaked figure we know today. For Romania, the association with Dracula has been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has drawn visitors eager to see the lands of the real Dracula, to walk through Bran Castle, to gaze upon the misty hills and imagine the vampire lord rising under the full moon. On the other hand, it has overshadowed the complex history of Vlad the Impaler, reducing a ruler who fought for his land's sovereignty into a caricature of horror. Yet even within this transformation, there is a quiet truth. Vlad's story was always about power, fear, and survival in a world that offered little mercy. The vampire myth, in many ways, reflects the realities of the time, a world where death was close, where borders were fragile, and where the line between life and death, myth and memory, was thin. In the quiet of the night, when the winds rustle through the dark forests of Wallachia and the moonlight falls softly on the ruins of old fortresses, it is easy to imagine the ghost of Vlad walking among the trees, a figure both feared and respected, his legacy as complex as the mists that drift across the valleys. The Dracula myth, born from stories of blood and war, from pamphlets of fear and novels of Gothic imagination, has ensured that Vlad's name will never fade into obscurity. It is a legend that has outlived kingdoms and empires, crossing from the history of a small principality into the collective imagination of the world. As we close this segment, let us remember that Dracula was once a man, a prince who ruled in the shadow of greater powers, who fought to protect his land with methods that would become legend, and whose name would travel far beyond the rivers and forests of Wallachia. The line between myth and history may blur, but in that blur lies the story of Vlad the Impaler, the prince who became Dracula, whose shadow still moves quietly in the mists of the past. As dawn spread its pale light over Wallachia, the forests waking with the rustle of leaves and the soft calls of birds, the roads that wound through the valleys remained silent witnesses to the alliances and rivalries that shaped the life of Vlad III. For while Vlad ruled his land with iron determination, his path was never walked alone. Every decision, every moment of triumph, and every act of brutality was shadowed by the presence of powerful allies and enemies, figures whose choices would shape not only Vlad's reign, but the fragile future of Wallachia itself. One of the most formidable among these figures was Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottoman ruler known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror. The Sultan had taken Constantinople in 1453, a feat that shook the Christian kingdoms of Europe and marked the Ottoman Empire as a rising power impossible to ignore. Ambitious and relentless, Mehmed's eyes turned toward Wallachia not out of mere curiosity, but as part of a broader plan to secure the empire's northern borders, ensuring that vassal states like Wallachia paid tribute and posed no threat to Ottoman expansion. Vlad's relationship with Mehmed was complex, colored by the years he spent as a hostage at the Ottoman court, where he observed the Sultan's power firsthand. Vlad understood the might of the Ottoman armies, the discipline of the Janissaries, and the iron will of Mehmed himself. Yet when he returned to rule Wallachia, Vlad chose defiance, refusing to pay the tribute demanded by the Sultan and executing Ottoman envoys in acts that were as much declarations of independence as they were challenges to Mehmed's authority. The tension between Mehmed and Vlad came to a head in 1462, when the Sultan led a massive army across the Danube to bring Wallachia to heel. The resulting conflict, marked by Vlad's guerrilla tactics and the infamous night attack, was a testament to Vlad's refusal to submit, even in the face of overwhelming force. For Mehmed, Vlad was a thorn that could not be easily removed, a defiant ruler whose actions threatened the image of Ottoman invincibility. Yet Mehmed, cautious and pragmatic, recognized the difficulties of subduing a land as fiercely defended as Wallachia, choosing eventually to withdraw rather than risk a protracted conflict that could drain his empire's resources. While Mehmed stood as a powerful enemy at Vlad's southern border, to the north lay another force that would shape Vlad's fate: Hungary. Hungary, under the regency of John Hunyadi and later under King Matthias Corvinus, viewed Wallachia as a vital buffer state against Ottoman expansion. The relationship between Hungary and Vlad was one of shifting alliances, driven by the tides of necessity and the pressures of regional politics. Hunyadi, despite having previously played a role in the downfall of Vlad's father, found common cause with Vlad in resisting the Ottomans, providing military support that allowed Vlad to reclaim the Wallachian throne in 1456. Under Matthias Corvinus, however, the relationship grew strained. While Vlad sought Hungarian support against Mehmed's campaigns, Matthias, navigating the delicate politics of the region, chose to distance himself, prioritizing Hungary's stability over the needs of his Wallachian ally. In 1462, after Vlad's bold resistance against Mehmed, Matthias, under pressure from diplomatic complications and possibly influenced by false Ottoman accusations and Saxon complaints, had Vlad imprisoned in Hungary, where he would remain for over a decade. For Vlad, the betrayal was a bitter reminder of the dangers of relying on foreign powers, reinforcing the lesson that alliances could shift as quickly as the winds that swept over the Carpathian peaks. Yet among all the figures who shaped Vlad's life, none cast a shadow as personal and painful as Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother. Radu, like Vlad, had been taken as a hostage to the Ottoman court during their youth. Unlike Vlad, who returned to Wallachia with defiance in his heart, Radu embraced life under Ottoman rule, converting to Islam and earning the favor of Sultan Mehmed II. Known for his charm and diplomacy, Radu became a valuable ally to the Ottomans, eventually leading campaigns against Vlad on behalf of Mehmed. The conflict between the brothers was more than a political struggle. It was a collision of paths shaped by their shared past and divided by their choices. While Vlad fought to assert Wallachian independence through fear and resistance, Radu sought to secure his power by aligning with the Ottomans, promising a more stable relationship between Wallachia and its powerful southern neighbor. During the 1462 campaign, as Mehmed's forces advanced into Wallachia, Radu led Ottoman-supported factions within the country, rallying boyars who had grown weary of Vlad's harsh rule and saw in Radu an opportunity for stability under Ottoman protection. Villages that once flew Vlad's banners shifted their loyalties, opening their gates to Radu, who promised them peace and an end to the terror of impalements. For Vlad, the betrayal was profound. To fight an enemy is one challenge, but to fight one's own brother, a mirror of oneself shaped by a different vision of survival, was a wound that cut deeper than the edge of any blade. Yet Vlad did not yield easily, continuing to fight, retreat, and strike back, his determination unbroken even as support for Radu grew. Ultimately, Vlad was forced into exile, seeking aid from Hungary once more, only to find himself imprisoned, his land left under the control of Radu, who ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman vassal. For the people of Wallachia, the arrival of Radu brought a different kind of rule, a quieter governance under Ottoman oversight, a stark contrast to the fearsome authority of Vlad. And so, as dawns continued to break over Wallachia, as mists rose from its rivers and the forests whispered under the wind, the land carried the memory of these figures. Mehmed, the conqueror who loomed at the border, Matthias, the ally who became a jailer, and Radu, the brother who returned with an army, offering peace under the shadow of foreign power. For Vlad, these relationships were the defining forces of his reign, shaping his actions and reinforcing the belief that only through unwavering strength could Wallachia survive in a world where alliances were fleeting, and betrayal was often just a matter of convenience. As we close this segment, let us remember that Vlad's story was never that of a solitary ruler, but of a man navigating the stormy currents of politics, alliances, and family ties in a world that offered little mercy. His enemies and allies alike shaped the roads he walked, the decisions he made, and the legacy that would transform him into the figure of legend. In the quiet of night, when the winds sweep softly over the dark fields of Wallachia, the echoes of these alliances and rivalries still linger, reminding us that even the harshest rulers are shaped by the pressures of the world around them, their actions both a reflection of their will and a response to the relentless tides of history. Part 4. Light and Dark, Hero or Monster. As dawn breaks softly over the Carpathian ridges, the valleys of Wallachia are bathed in gentle gray light, dew shimmering on the grass, and the scent of wood smoke rising from quiet villages where roosters call against the stillness of the morning. In these villages, where life has always moved to the slow rhythms of seasons and harvests, stories have been passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, whispered in the hush of winter nights or beside the warmth of a summer hearth. Among these stories, the name Vlad the Impaler, is spoken not only with fear but with a certain reverence, a recognition that within the harshness of his rule lay a fierce, unwavering determination to protect Wallachia from the shadows pressing against its fragile borders. For while the Saxon merchants and the chroniclers of distant lands painted Vlad as a monster, in Wallachia and in the hearts of many Romanians, he was a protector, a ruler who refused to yield to the Ottomans, who saw the creeping advance of empire not as a tide to be accepted, but as a threat to be resisted, even if resistance required fire, steel, and the iron will to do what others would not. Wallachia in the 15th century was a land under constant threat. To the south, the Ottoman Empire grew stronger, its armies sweeping across the Balkans, demanding tribute and submission from those who wished to avoid destruction. To the north, the Kingdom of Hungary sought to secure its own influence over the region. And within Wallachia itself, the powerful boyars often shifted loyalties, prioritizing personal wealth and safety over the stability of their homeland. For the peasants who worked the fields, who led their oxen along muddy roads to market, and who knelt in small wooden churches to pray for the safety of their children. These pressures were more than politics. They were the quiet fear that their homes could be burned, their sons taken as tribute, and their futures stolen by forces beyond their control. It was in this fragile world that Vlad rose to power, and it was in this world that many saw his harshness not as cruelty for cruelty's sake, but as a necessary shield against chaos. When Vlad refused to pay tribute to the Ottoman Empire, it was an act of defiance that resonated deeply within Wallachia. Tribute was more than gold. It was a symbol of submission, a reminder that Wallachia was not truly free. By defying the Sultan, Vlad declared that Wallachia would not simply bow, that it would fight to remain its own, even if the cost was high. The people saw how Vlad strengthened the land's defenses, how he cleared the roads of bandits who preyed upon merchants and travelers, and how he imposed order in a realm often torn by the ambitions of boyars who cared little for the common people. Under Vlad, a peasant could walk the roads without as much fear of thieves, and a merchant could travel to market without the constant threat of extortion by corrupt officials. These changes were not made through gentle persuasion but through fear, and the price was visible along the roads where the bodies of the impaled stood as silent, swaying reminders of Vlad's justice. Yet for many, these grim sights were also reminders that the voivode's eyes were everywhere, that the powerful could no longer steal from the weak without consequence, and that the land, at least for a time, was under the protection of a ruler who placed the safety of Wallachia above all else. Stories from the villages tell of Vlad walking among his people in disguise, testing the honesty of merchants, ensuring the fairness of trade, and enforcing his laws with a hand that spared no one, rich or poor, who broke them. One legend, often retold, speaks of the golden cup placed at a public well, left there for travelers to drink from. Under Vlad's rule, it was said the cup remained untouched, a testament to the fear of punishment that kept even the poorest beggar from stealing. The people of Wallachia also witnessed Vlad's fierce resistance against the Ottoman incursions, especially during the campaign of 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II himself crossed the Danube with a vast army to subdue the defiant prince. They saw Vlad's tactics, the use of scorched earth to deny the invaders supplies, the guerrilla attacks in the forests, and the audacious night attack, where Vlad and his men struck the Ottoman camp under darkness, creating chaos and fear among an army many believed to be unstoppable. For the peasants, who watched the fires in the distance and felt the tremors of marching armies, these acts were signs that their prince would not abandon them, that he would fight for their land even when facing a force far greater than his own. They knew the cost of war, the burned fields and empty granaries, yet they also knew that submission would mean a slower death, the steady drain of tribute, the loss of dignity, and the creeping domination of a foreign power that would erase the fragile identity of Wallachia. In their prayers, the people asked for protection, for courage, and for the safety of their homes. Many believed that Vlad's harsh rule was an answer to those prayers, a shield forged from the necessity of survival, a bitter medicine that kept the sickness of fear and conquest at bay. Generations later, as the centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the memory of Vlad remained within Romanian folklore, complex and layered. He was seen as a defender of the faith and the land, a ruler who did not flinch when facing the might of the Ottoman Empire, a prince who ruled with justice that, while brutal, was seen as fair in its unwavering application. This perception became especially important during times when Romanians faced foreign rule and pressures to assimilate, as Vlad's legacy became a symbol of resistance, of the unyielding desire to protect the land and the people's identity. His name, Vlad Tepes, carried the weight of defiance, reminding the people that Wallachia, and by extension Romania, had once stood against the tide of conquest and could do so again if needed. Even as the Dracula myth grew in the West, transforming Vlad into a creature of the night, within Romania, many continued to see the man behind the legend. They saw a ruler whose actions, however harsh, were aimed at preserving Wallachia's independence in a world where survival often demanded a willingness to confront the darkness without hesitation. In the quiet moments, as families gathered in their homes, stories of Vlad were told alongside those of saints and heroes, of battles fought for freedom, and of the mountains and rivers that had witnessed these struggles. Children would listen with wide eyes, learning that courage sometimes comes at a cost, and that justice, to be effective, must often be strong enough to withstand fear. Remember that Vlad's legacy in Romania is not that of a monster, but of a ruler who, in the eyes of many, protected his land with the only tools he believed would work in a harsh and unforgiving world. His story is a reminder that history is rarely simple, that the same acts can be seen as cruelty or courage depending on where you stand, and that even the harshest rulers may be remembered as heroes by those who lived under their protection. In the quiet dawns of Wallachia, where the mist drifts over the rivers and the forests whisper in the breeze, the memory of Vlad the Protector remains in the land he fought to defend, reminding those who walk its roads that survival sometimes demands a courage willing to embrace darkness, for the light that must be preserved. As dawn spilled pale light over the markets of Saxony, over the streets of Nuremberg and the stone bridges of Vienna, the world felt both distant and near to the small, fog-shrouded principalities of Eastern Europe. Traders set up stalls, the scent of roasted chestnuts and burning wood drifting in the morning chill, and the low murmur of bargaining voices rose with the smoke. In these cities, where merchants and printers busied themselves with ledgers and new broadsheets, stories from the East arrived carried by merchants, envoys, and the occasional trembling refugee. And in these stories, the name Vlad Tepes was a curse, spoken with a shudder as travelers shared tales of roads lined with impaled bodies, of prisoners groaning upon stakes, of a ruler whose thirst for blood knew no limits. To the west, Vlad was not a hero or protector. He was a demon in human form. These stories first took root in the Saxon merchant towns of Transylvania, where Vlad's harsh taxation policies and enforcement of trade laws had turned commerce into a battleground. Merchants who once moved freely under special privileges found themselves paying heavy duties under Vlad's decrees, their goods seized when they refused, and their fellow traders sometimes executed for defiance. The boyars and merchants who opposed him saw not a ruler imposing justice, but a tyrant choking their livelihoods. As the conflicts between Vlad and the Saxon merchants escalated, stories of his punishments began to circulate, each tale more terrifying than the last. They spoke of entire merchant caravans captured and impaled outside the town walls, of towns sacked and burned under Vlad's orders, of women and children fleeing as soldiers set fire to markets, and of Vlad watching these scenes with cold satisfaction. The printing press, a new force in Europe, played its role in amplifying these stories. In the late 1400s, German printers began publishing pamphlets describing Vlad's deeds in lurid detail, with woodcut illustrations showing forests of stakes, men and women writhing in agony, and Vlad seated at a table, dining beneath the bodies of the impaled, a goblet raised to his lips. Titles such as The Frightening and Truly Extraordinary History of a Wild Blood-Drinking Tyrant Called Dracula sold well among a public hungry for tales of terror and darkness. In an age when printed pamphlets were becoming the social media of their time, Vlad's image as a monster spread rapidly, reaching courts and marketplaces across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. To the German and Hungarian merchants, these stories served both as cautionary tales and political tools. They justified resistance against Vlad's policies, rallied support for intervention in Wallachia, and warned others of the dangers of allowing such a ruler to hold power unchecked. They also satisfied a fascination with the exotic and the terrible, feeding the European appetite for stories of distant cruelty. To the Hungarian crown, Vlad was both an ally and a problem. King Matthias Corvinus supported Vlad when it suited Hungary's interests against the Ottomans, but distanced himself when the Saxons and other political pressures demanded it. Vlad's reputation as a bloodthirsty ruler made him easy to abandon when diplomacy required Hungary to demonstrate restraint or to placate powerful merchant cities. For the Ottomans, Vlad's defiance and brutal tactics were a direct challenge to their authority. But the tales of his cruelty also served as propaganda, reinforcing the need to subdue such a ruler and framing Ottoman campaigns as acts of civilization against barbarism. As these stories traveled, they grew in the telling. It was said Vlad had impaled 20,000 to 40,000 people during his reign, that he had executed entire villages for minor offenses, that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims, and that he took pleasure in torturing the innocent. Chroniclers like Antonio Bonfini, an Italian historian at the Hungarian court, and various German writers captured these rumors and preserved them in their works, ensuring Vlad's infamy would stretch beyond his lifetime. The Western view of Vlad was not merely the product of fear. It was shaped by the cultural context of Europe at the time. The late medieval period was marked by anxiety over shifting powers, with the Ottoman Empire expanding into Europe, the fall of Constantinople still fresh in memory, and fears of invasion hanging over kingdoms like a dark cloud. The figure of Vlad became a symbol of Eastern cruelty, a frightening reflection of what lay beyond the borders of Christendom. He was described as Dracula, son of the devil, with some pamphlets even suggesting he was in league with dark forces, a man whose cruelty exceeded human limits and could only be explained by the influence of demonic powers. The word Dracula itself, derived from Drac, meaning dragon in Romanian but also associated with Drac, meaning devil, fed into this perception, blending fear and religious anxiety into the stories that circulated. For the average citizen of Nuremberg, Vienna, or Krakow, Vlad was a name spoken when discussing the horrors of the East, a reminder of a world of cruelty and bloodshed that lay just beyond the mountains. These stories served as warnings about tyranny and the thin line between order and savagery, reinforcing cultural perceptions of the East as a place of violence and superstition. Yet in the echoes of these stories, there was also an uneasy fascination. The same Vlad who terrified traders and villagers became a subject of dark curiosity, his image captured in woodcuts and retold in taverns, courts, and around family hearths. He became a part of Europe's collective imagination, a figure who both repelled and drew the gaze, a monster whose legend would one day evolve into the vampire myth of Dracula. It is important to remember that these Western stories, while rooted in truths of Vlad's harsh rule, were shaped and colored by fear, politics, and the need for stories that explain the chaos of the world. They reflected Europe's anxieties about the encroaching Ottomans, about the power of tyrants, and about the thin veneer of civilization that separated them from violence. As dawn turned to morning in the markets of Europe, traders would share these tales over barrels of salt and bundles of cloth, passing on the stories of Vlad the Impaler with widened eyes and lowered voices, adding to the tapestry of rumor and fear that would cement his image in the West as a bloodthirsty demon. As we close this segment, let us remember that the Western image of Vlad was one born of distance, fear, and the need for stories that explained a world teetering on the edge of change. Vlad, the Prince of Wallachia, became Vlad the Monster, the Impaler, the Devil's Son, a figure whose actions, real and imagined, would echo in the imagination of Europe long after his death. In the quiet hours of the night, when the winds move softly over Europe's old streets, the whispers of Vlad's cruelty still linger, reminders of how fear and rumor can transform a man into a legend, and a legend into a monster whose shadow remains in the world's imagination, centuries after the last stake was raised beneath the cold dawn sky. As the dawn mist drifts over the rivers and the ancient forests of Wallachia, soft light illuminating the rough wooden homes and the frost-kissed grass, the world seems to pause, listening to the whispers of the past that linger in the cold air. Among these whispers are the stories of Vlad the Impaler, tales told in hushed voices by travelers and recorded in trembling script by scribes who had never seen the man but felt the weight of his legend. These stories speak of cruelties so dark that they feel almost impossible to imagine, tales of blood drinking, of bathing in the gore of his victims, of children impaled alongside their mothers, of pregnant women disemboweled for amusement, and of a ruler who feasted among the dead, savoring the terror of his enemies. These are the stories that painted Vlad as a monster, the foundation of the Dracula legend, and the tales that traveled further than any army could march, shaping how Europe would remember him for centuries. Yet in the quiet reflection of history, we must ask, how much of this was true, and how much was the product of fear, politics, and propaganda? To understand how these rumors grew, we must return to the context of Vlad's rule. Wallachia was a land caught between powerful neighbors, where betrayal was common, and rulers were often killed by those closest to them. Vlad's father and brother had both died due to political intrigue, and Vlad himself had been a hostage in the Ottoman Empire, learning firsthand the harsh realities of power. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he ruled with an iron hand, using fear to maintain order and protect his land from internal corruption and external threats. The stakes that lined the roads were real, a message to criminals and traitors that betrayal would not be tolerated. His methods were harsh, and his punishments public, creating a climate where fear kept the roads safe and the laws respected. Yet the scale and nature of these punishments, as reported by his enemies, are difficult to verify. Saxon merchants, angered by Vlad's enforcement of trade laws and taxation, printed pamphlets that described his deeds in lurid detail, often with illustrations of Vlad dining among forests of impaled bodies, drinking blood from bowls, and delighting in torture. Among these stories was the claim that Vlad drank the blood of his victims. Chroniclers wrote that he would dip his bread in the blood of the dying, a gruesome detail that would later feed directly into the Dracula myth. However, there is no contemporary Wallachian source that confirms this practice, and the accounts come almost exclusively from those who opposed Vlad and benefited from portraying him as a monster. Similarly, stories of bathing in blood or disemboweling pregnant women are found in the pamphlets and chronicles printed in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, written by those who had never witnessed Vlad's punishments firsthand, but relied on rumor and the testimonies of those with reasons to exaggerate his brutality. These tales, while shocking, often lack consistency, with different versions describing the same events in wildly different ways. It is also important to consider the use of propaganda in medieval Europe. Printing was a new and powerful tool, and tales of Vlad's cruelty sold well among readers who craved stories of distant horrors. Political rivals found it useful to depict Vlad as inhuman, using these rumors to justify intervention in Wallachia or to undermine his legitimacy. The Ottomans, too, contributed to these rumors, framing Vlad's defiance and brutal tactics as the actions of a madman to justify their campaigns against him. By painting Vlad as a bloodthirsty tyrant, they could portray their invasions as acts of civilization rather than conquest. Yet within Wallachia, where the people lived under Vlad's rule, these stories were less prominent. The people knew of the stakes and the harsh punishments, but they also saw the roads cleared of bandits, the markets functioning under fair laws, and a ruler who refused to bow to foreign demands. For them, Vlad's harshness was the price of stability, and while they may have feared him, they did not view him as a supernatural monster. Modern historians, when examining these accounts, recognize the need for caution. The numbers often cited, 20,000, 30,000, even 40,000 victims, likely include exaggerations, inflated by enemies and chroniclers seeking to emphasize Vlad's cruelty. While it is clear that Vlad used impalement as a method of execution and did so on a large scale to send a message, the details of drinking blood and feasting among the dead remain unproven, part of the mythos that surrounded him. Additionally, the cultural lens of the time must be considered. Medieval Europe was a world where public executions were common. Torture was used as a tool of justice, and rulers across the continent used fear to maintain order. Vlad's methods, while brutal, were not entirely out of place in this context, though the theatrical scale and his consistency in applying these punishments made him stand out. In the silence of dawn, as the mist rises and the world seems to hold its breath, it becomes clear that the line between Vlad the ruler and Vlad the legend is thin, woven together by fear, propaganda, and the need for stories that explain a harsh and chaotic world. The rumors of blood drinking, of bathing in gore, and of unimaginable cruelty became part of a narrative that overshadowed the complexities of Vlad's reign, reducing a man shaped by betrayal and war into a symbol of darkness. Yet behind these stories was a ruler who faced the constant threat of invasion, who struggled to maintain his land's independence, and who used the tools he believed necessary to survive in a world that offered no mercy. As we close this segment, let us remember that while the whispers of Vlad's unproven cruelties echo in the shadows of history, they tell us as much about the fears of those who spread them as they do about the man himself. Vlad the Impaler remains a figure caught between truth and myth, a ruler whose harshness was real but whose legend grew into something darker, shaped by the needs of enemies and the imaginations of a Europe eager for tales of monsters in the forests of the East. In the quiet hours of the night, when the wind moves softly over the forests of Wallachia, these stories still linger, reminders of how easily fear can transform history into legend, and how legends can overshadow the complex truths of those who came before us. As the final leaves fell from the trees in the cold breath of late autumn, the roads of Wallachia grew quiet, the frost crunching softly beneath the boots of travelers and the hooves of tired horses. The fires burned low in village hearths, and the people, wrapped in thick cloaks, whispered prayers for protection against the long winter nights and the unseen dangers that drifted through the forests. It was during this time of darkness and uncertainty that the story of Vlad the Impaler's end unfolded, wrapped in as much mystery and rumor as the life he had lived. By 1476, Vlad's rule had become a cycle of rise and fall, of reclaiming the throne and losing it again in the endless struggle for power that marked the politics of Wallachia. After years of imprisonment under the Hungarian crown and negotiations that shifted with the tides of European diplomacy, Vlad returned once more to claim his place as voivode, supported by Hungarian forces under Matthias Corvinus and by Moldavian allies who saw in Vlad a bulwark against the advancing Ottoman threat. His return was met with a cautious hope among the people. They remembered his harshness, but they also remembered the safety of the roads, the order in the markets, and the strength that had kept Ottoman forces at bay. As Vlad reclaimed Targovist, the cold winds that swept through the streets carried whispers that perhaps the prince who had once ruled with fear would now bring stability once again. But the land Vlad sought to protect was fragile, caught between the ambitions of Hungary, the power of the Ottomans, and the internal divisions of the Wallachian boyars, many of whom had long grown weary of Vlad's harsh justice. The boyars who had betrayed him before remained, their loyalties shifting like the wind, driven by the need to survive and protect their wealth and influence in a world where alliances could mean the difference between life and death. Vlad's final days were marked by tension and uncertainty. As he prepared to confront Ottoman incursions, rumors spread of betrayal within his own ranks. Some said the boyars conspired with the Ottomans, seeking to rid themselves of a ruler whose demands for loyalty were too high, whose punishments for disobedience were too severe. Others spoke of Hungarian agents who found Vlad's presence inconvenient, preferring a Wallachia that was weaker and easier to control. The exact circumstances of Vlad's death remained shrouded in mystery, lost in the silence of the forests and the whispers of those who lived through that cold winter. What is known is that Vlad died in December 1476, near Bucharest, during a skirmish with Ottoman forces. One account suggests that Vlad was killed in battle, leading his forces against an Ottoman incursion, his sword raised as he fought to protect his land, his death a warrior's end on the muddy, frost-covered fields of Wallachia. In this version, Vlad fell surrounded by enemies, fighting until the last breath, refusing to yield even in the face of overwhelming odds. Another account, darker and filled with the betrayal that had so often marked Vlad's life, suggests that he was assassinated by his own men, either bribed by the Ottomans or by internal enemies who saw in Vlad's death an opportunity to secure their own safety and power. Some stories claim that in the chaos of battle, Vlad was struck down by a Wallachian soldier who mistook him for an Ottoman, his armor similar to those of his enemies, his death a tragic mistake that ended the reign of one of Wallachia's most formidable rulers. Yet another rumor, told in hushed tones, claims that the Ottomans themselves captured and executed Vlad, severing his head as proof of their victory. It is said that Vlad's head was taken to Constantinople, preserved in honey to prevent decay during the journey, and presented to Sultan Mehmed II, who gazed upon the face of the man who had defied him, whose forests of stakes had once forced him to pause, whose resistance had burned like a thorn in the side of the Ottoman advance. For the people of Wallachia, Vlad's death was met with a mixture of fear, relief, and mourning. Some saw his passing as the end of a harsh but protective rule, fearing the uncertainty that would follow without his iron hand to maintain order. Others, who had suffered under his punishments, saw his death as a liberation, a chance to breathe freely without the constant fear of the stakes lining the roads. The burial of Vlad is as mysterious as his death. Many believe that Vlad was buried at Snagov Monastery, located on a quiet island in the middle of a lake, the mist rising around its stone walls as the monks carried out their prayers. Yet when archaeologists opened what was believed to be Vlad's grave in the 20th century, it was found empty, fueling rumors that his body had been moved, hidden, or perhaps, in the minds of the superstitious, that Vlad himself had never truly died. This mystery, wrapped around Vlad's death and burial, fed directly into the growing legends that would transform him into Dracula, the vampire lord who could not die, whose thirst for blood was eternal, and whose spirit still roamed the forests and mountains of Wallachia under the light of the moon. Yet for those who lived in Wallachia, who remembered the man rather than the legend, Vlad's death marked the end of an era. A time of fear, yes, but also of defiance, of a prince who dared to challenge the power of the Ottoman Empire, who sought to protect his land from betrayal, and who used fear not for pleasure, but as a weapon in a world that often left rulers with few choices. As dawn rose over the frost-covered fields and the mist curled around the trunks of ancient oaks, the people of Wallachia returned to their lives, tending to their flocks and fields, raising their children, and whispering prayers that the chaos of power struggles would not once again consume their fragile land. Vlad was gone, but the memory of his rule remained in the silent roads that once had been safe, in the fields that had been defended, and in the dark forests that had witnessed his battles. In the quiet of the nights that followed, as the winds swept softly over the valleys and the moonlight touched the ruins of old fortresses, the people of Wallachia remembered Vlad the Impaler. Not as the vampire of legend, but as the prince who had ruled with the conviction that survival demanded strength, who met his end surrounded by enemies, and whose death was as complex and shadowed as the life he had lived. Vlad's death, like his life, remains a story told in the spaces between history and legend, a reminder that even the harshest rulers are human, shaped by the forces of their time, and that the whispers of betrayal, loyalty, and defiance continue to echo in the quiet dawns of a land that once called him prince. Part 5: Legacy, Controversies, and Lessons from Vlad the Impaler. In the soft hush of dawn, as the mist lifts from the low hills of Wallachia and the first light catches on the frost of winter fields, the roads and rivers of the land remain as silent witnesses to the questions left behind by Vlad the Impaler. Questions of power, survival, and the true cost of ruling with fear linger in the cold air, drifting like whispers through the ancient forests that once saw the rise and fall of princes who sought to protect this fragile land. For Vlad, fear was not merely a tool. It was a strategy born of necessity in a world that offered no mercy to the weak. His use of impalement, the harsh punishments for betrayal and theft, and the ruthless suppression of the boyars were not acts of random cruelty in his eyes, but measures taken to secure Wallachia against internal corruption and external conquest. And for a time, fear worked. During Vlad's reign, the roads of Wallachia, once plagued by bandits, became safer for merchants and travelers. Stories of the golden cup left at a public well, untouched under Vlad's rule, reflected a land where even the poorest peasant dared not steal for fear of the consequences. Local markets, once burdened by corrupt officials and powerful merchants, operated under laws enforced without favoritism, ensuring that no one, regardless of wealth or position, was above the reach of justice. Fear also served as a deterrent against the Ottoman Empire, a reminder that Wallachia would not submit quietly to foreign demands. When Vlad refused to pay tribute and impaled Ottoman envoys who dared to demand it, he sent a message that his land, however small and fragile, would resist domination. His forests of stakes, terrible as they were, forced even Sultan Mehmed II to hesitate, recognizing that subduing Wallachia would not be as simple as crushing a compliant vassal. Yet the cost of rule by fear was heavy, and it echoed long after the fires in Vlad's fortresses had burned out. For while fear brought order, it also bred resentment and quiet rebellion. The boyars, stripped of their unchecked power and subjected to Vlad's harsh control, never forgot the humiliation and the threat to their status. When opportunities arose to undermine Vlad or to support rivals, they did so, seeing in his downfall a return to the freedoms they valued more than the stability he imposed. The people, while safer on the roads, lived under the constant shadow of Vlad's justice. For many peasants, the fear that kept the roads clear also kept their heads bowed, uncertain when the harshness that protected them might turn upon them for reasons they did not fully understand. The lines between justice and oppression were thin, and the certainty that wrongdoing would be punished came with the chilling reality that mistakes or accusations could lead to the same fate. Internationally, Vlad's reliance on fear isolated him from potential allies. The Hungarian crown, while supporting Vlad when convenient, found his methods problematic when dealing with the Saxon merchants and other influential parties. His infamy, fueled by the printed pamphlets describing his cruelties, made it easier for political rivals to abandon him when diplomacy required it, portraying him as a tyrant rather than a defender of Christendom. Fear also proved insufficient against the relentless pressures of geopolitics. Despite his successes in resisting the Ottomans, Wallachia remained a small principality surrounded by greater powers. Vlad's refusal to submit made him a symbol of defiance, but it did not secure Wallachia's independence in the long term, nor did it free the land from the constant threat of invasion or the demands of tribute that would eventually return under other rulers. And yet, in the quiet dawns that followed his death, the people of Wallachia remembered that for a time, under Vlad, their land was defended with unwavering resolve. His methods were harsh, but they were effective in protecting Wallachia from the worst excesses of corruption and conquest. In a world where betrayal was common and weakness invited destruction, Vlad's fear-driven rule offered a fragile peace, even if it came wrapped in the darkness of impalement and the silence of fear. The political legacy of Vlad the Impaler forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about leadership in times of crisis. Can fear be a tool for justice? Can harshness preserve freedom where negotiation fails? And at what point does the cost of fear outweigh the security it brings? Modern historians see in Vlad's rule a reflection of the realities of his time, where rulers were forced to choose between harsh measures and the chaos of constant betrayal. where power was secured not by words, but by actions that inspired fear in those who would undermine it. While his legacy is often overshadowed by the Dracula myth, Vlad's true impact lies in the reminder that survival often demands strength, and that strength, when wielded without compassion, can leave scars that last longer than any victory. As we close this segment, let us remember that Vlad's political legacy is not a simple story of cruelty or heroism, but a complex reflection of a land fighting to survive in the shadow of empires. His rule by fear worked, but only for a time, and the whispers of those days still drift through the forests of Wallachia, asking us to consider the price of safety and the burden carried by those who choose to rule with the cold hand of necessity. In the quiet dawn, as the mist rises and the first light touches the dark branches of the ancient trees, the memory of Vlad's rule remains, a reminder that fear, for all its power, is a fragile foundation on which to build the hope of a people, and that true strength to endure must find its balance between justice and mercy. As the dawn mist drifts across the hills of Wallachia, touching the dark forests and the winding rivers with soft light, the stories of Vlad the Impaler rise like quiet breath in the cold air. For while his political legacy left roads safe and boyars cautious, it is his cultural legacy that has endured longest, transforming a prince of a small principality into an immortal figure recognized around the world. This transformation began not in Wallachia itself, but in the whispers of traders, the ink of pamphleteers, and the cautious tales of chroniclers, who described Vlad's impalements and harsh punishments with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Saxon merchants who printed stories of Vlad's cruelty never intended to create a legend. They sought to warn and rally, using his image as a bloodthirsty tyrant to justify their grievances and fears. Yet these pamphlets found eager audiences across Europe, feeding a cultural appetite for the exotic and the terrifying. They described Vlad as a man who drank the blood of his enemies, who dined among forests of the impaled, and who delighted in the suffering of others. Each retelling made the stories darker, each woodcut illustration more gruesome, until Vlad's name became synonymous with cruelty. But the legend did not stop there. As centuries passed, Europe's fascination with the mysterious lands of the East grew, with travelers returning with stories of the Carpathian Mountains, mist-filled valleys, and ancient fortresses perched on cliffs like silent watchers of the past. The lands of Wallachia and Transylvania became the perfect canvas upon which to project tales of dark lords and supernatural terrors. Into this landscape stepped Bram Stoker, the Irish writer whose 1897 novel, Dracula, would cement Vlad's place in cultural history forever. Stoker, researching Eastern European folklore, came across the name Dracula and its associations with Vlad the Impaler. The word tied to Drac, meaning dragon or devil in Romanian, carried with it a weight of darkness and intrigue. Stoker did not set out to write a historical account of Vlad's life. Instead, he wove the essence of the legend into his Gothic tale, transforming Vlad into Count Dracula, an immortal vampire who fed on the blood of the living, who could transform into a bat or a wolf, who haunted the night and was hunted by brave men determined to end his reign of darkness. The Dracula of Stoker's novel was not the Vlad of history, yet the threads of the past ran through the fabric of the fiction. The real Vlad defended his land with brutality, using fear to maintain order, while Stoker's Dracula defended his cursed existence with the hunger of the undead. Both figures, however, became symbols of the unknown and the fear it inspires, reminders of the thin line between life and death, between the natural and the supernatural. As the novel gained popularity, the legend of Dracula grew, adapted into plays and eventually films that would spread the vampire's image across the world. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula in the 1931 film brought the Count to life for a new generation, with his cape, his piercing gaze, and his whispered promises of eternal life shaping the modern image of the vampire. In the decades that followed, Dracula became a cultural icon, appearing in countless adaptations, parodies, and reinterpretations. From Christopher Lee's chilling performances to modern retellings in television and literature, Dracula's shadow has remained long and constant, a reminder that fear, once planted, grows roots that stretch across time. For Romania, the legacy of Vlad as Dracula has been complex. On one hand, the legend has brought visitors from around the world, eager to see Bran Castle, often marketed as Dracula's Castle, and to walk the misty paths of Transylvania in search of the vampire's spirit. Tourism has flourished, with tours and festivals celebrating the Dracula myth while connecting visitors to the real history of Vlad the Impaler. On the other hand, the focus on Dracula often overshadows Vlad's true place in Romanian history. Many Romanians see Vlad as a protector, a ruler who resisted Ottoman domination and enforced justice in a chaotic time, and they view the vampire legend as a distortion that reduces a complex historical figure to a supernatural caricature. Yet the legend cannot be easily separated from the man. The Dracula myth has ensured that Vlad's name will never be forgotten, keeping alive the memory of a ruler who once walked the forests of Wallachia, even if the stories have twisted his image into something darker. The impalements, the harsh justice, and the fear he inspired have become part of the larger narrative, reminding the world of a time when power was fragile and survival often demanded unthinkable choices. In the quiet of the dawn, as the mists rise and the forests whisper in the cold breeze, the presence of Dracula feels almost tangible in these lands. Yet beneath the legend lies the true story of Vlad the Impaler, a ruler who used fear to protect his land, who fought against the tides of conquest, and whose life and actions were shaped by the harsh realities of his time. As we close this segment, let us remember that cultural legacy is not always what we choose but what the world sees in us. Vlad's transformation into Dracula is a reminder of how stories evolve, how history becomes legend, and how legends become symbols that outlive the people who inspired them. In the soft dawn light over Wallachia, Dracula's shadow may stretch across the valleys, but it is Vlad's footsteps that still echo in the quiet, a reminder that every legend has a seed of truth, and every truth, once told, becomes a part of the story we carry forward. As the dawn mist drifts quietly over the dark forests and cold rivers of Wallachia, the past feels close, like a breath on the back of the neck. It is in this soft, gray silence that the life of Vlad the Impaler is remembered, not only in stories of terror, but in the slow, careful work of scholars who sift through the ashes of history, searching for truth within the legends that have wrapped themselves around his name. The figure of Vlad Tepes, caught between hero and monster, between patriot and butcher, has long challenged historians. For centuries, chroniclers, propagandists, and storytellers have shaped his image, each adding new details, each twisting old facts, until the man himself is nearly lost within the shadows cast by his own story. At the heart of scholarly debate lies the difficulty of sources. Much of what we know about Vlad comes from documents written by his enemies. German Saxon merchants whose economic interests clashed with his rule, Ottoman chroniclers who viewed him as a defiant adversary, and Hungarian political figures who found it convenient to highlight his brutality while using his actions to further their diplomatic goals. These sources often describe Vlad's impalements in gruesome detail, list staggering numbers of victims, and tell stories of blood drinking and unimaginable cruelty. Yet scholars recognize that these accounts were shaped by propaganda, intended to paint Vlad as a villain to justify political and military actions against him. The Saxon pamphlets printed in Germany, for instance, were as much a tool for rallying support as they were a record of events, using sensational stories to sway opinion and gather resources. On the other side, Romanian and Moldavian chronicles, though fewer in number, offer a different perspective, viewing Vlad as a ruler who enforced justice in a land torn by corruption and betrayal. They praise his determination to resist Ottoman domination and remember him as a figure of strength who brought a harsh but necessary order to Wallachia. This dual perception of Vlad, cruel tyrant to some, national hero to others, reflects the reality of a ruler operating in a time and place where power was fragile and survival often demanded hard choices. Historians examining Vlad's reign acknowledge that while his use of impalement and fear was extreme, it was not entirely out of step with the methods of other rulers of his era, who used public executions, torture, and displays of power to maintain control. The numbers of Vlad's victims, often cited as tens of thousands, are another point of debate. While there is no doubt that Vlad used mass executions to enforce his rule, the exact figures remain uncertain. Contemporary records exaggerate for effect, and the practicalities of executing such large numbers with the resources available at the time raise questions about the accuracy of these claims. Yet the symbolic nature of Vlad's methods cannot be ignored. The forests of stakes that lined the roads were as much a psychological weapon as a physical one, ensuring that the threat of punishment was visible to all. Fear became a tool to stabilize Wallachia, to deter crime, and to assert independence against Ottoman demands. Scholars also debate Vlad's political motivations. Was his harshness purely cruelty, or was it a calculated response to a land constantly at risk of betrayal and invasion? Many historians argue that Vlad's brutality was a conscious strategy to consolidate power, break the influence of the boyars who had contributed to his father's downfall, and protect Wallachia from becoming a pawn in the geopolitical struggles of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Modern scholarship seeks to separate the man from the myth, acknowledging the real actions of Vlad while recognizing how fear and propaganda magnified them. Researchers cross-reference Saxon, Ottoman, Hungarian, and Wallachian records, compare the numbers and descriptions of events, and examine archaeological evidence to piece together a clearer picture of Vlad's reign. Through these studies, a more nuanced image of Vlad emerges, a prince shaped by a brutal world, whose harsh methods reflected the challenges of ruling a small principality surrounded by powerful neighbors. His reign, while undeniably violent, was also marked by administrative reforms, efforts to protect Wallachia's sovereignty, and attempts to create a system of justice that was consistent in its harshness. At the same time, scholars recognize the power of legend and how Vlad's story has transcended the boundaries of history to become a cultural symbol. The Dracula myth, while inaccurate as a representation of Vlad's life, reflects the enduring fascination with power, fear, and the unknown. It demonstrates how the stories we tell about the past are shaped by our fears and desires, becoming mirrors through which we see ourselves. In classrooms and quiet libraries, in lectures and late-night discussions, the debates about Vlad continue. Was he a cruel tyrant or a necessary ruler? Did he revel in bloodshed, or was he driven by the need to protect his land? These questions remain open, and perhaps they will never have definitive answers. As we close this segment, let us remember that history is not a fixed tale but a conversation across time, shaped by those who lived it, those who recorded it, and those who seek to understand it. Vlad the Impaler remains at the heart of this conversation, a figure whose life challenges us to look closely at the line between survival and cruelty, between justice and fear, between the man and the myth. In the dawn light over Wallachia, as the mists rise from the cold rivers and the forests whisper in the breeze, the memory of Vlad the Impaler remains. Not only in the stories of Dracula, but in the quiet questions asked by those who seek the truth hidden in the shadows of history. As dawn breaks softly over the frost-laced fields and dark forests of Wallachia, the story of Vlad the Impaler lingers in the cold morning air like a question whispered across centuries. His reign, marked by harshness, fear, and defiance, has long since ended, but the lessons of his life remain, waiting to be discovered by those who walk quietly through history's shadows in search of understanding. Vlad ruled in a world that offered no easy choices. His land was small and fragile, caught between the ambitions of powerful neighbors, where betrayal was a constant threat and survival required unwavering strength. His methods, public impalements, harsh justice, and rule by fear, can be difficult to comprehend from the comfort of modern stability. Yet in the silence of dawn, we can pause to reflect on what his life and choices teach us about power, fear, and leadership. One of the clearest lessons from Vlad's rule is that fear can be an effective tool, but it comes at a cost. Under Vlad, roads were cleared of bandits, trade became safer, and corrupt nobles were kept in check. His harsh punishments ensured that laws were respected and that betrayal was deterred, at least for a time. Fear brought order to a land that had often been ruled by chaos. Yet fear alone is not enough to build lasting loyalty. Vlad's reliance on harsh justice alienated the boyars, who ultimately turned against him, and left the people living under his rule in constant tension, never certain if they might be the next to face punishment. When fear is the foundation of rule, it can secure short-term stability, but it often sows seeds of resentment that grow quietly until they bloom into betrayal. This lesson echoes across history and into the present, reminding us that power secured through fear must eventually confront its own consequences, and that sustainable leadership requires trust and respect, not only obedience. Another lesson from Vlad's life is the importance of clear and consistent justice. While his punishments were harsh, Vlad applied his laws equally to the rich and the poor, ensuring that even the most powerful boyars were subject to the same rules as the humblest peasant. This consistency, however brutal, created a sense of order and fairness that many rulers of the time lacked. In a world where corruption and privilege often eroded justice, Vlad's equal application of the law stood as a reminder that for a society to function, the rules must apply to all. Today, this lesson remains relevant in the fight against corruption and in the ongoing struggle to ensure fairness within systems of governance. Vlad's reign also demonstrates the complexities of defending sovereignty in the face of overwhelming power. Faced with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, Vlad chose to resist rather than submit, even when it placed him at great personal risk. His defiance delayed Ottoman advances and forced even Sultan Mehmed II to reconsider his campaigns. This lesson speaks to the value of courage and the defense of autonomy, even when the odds seem impossible. Yet it also highlights the costs of defiance. Vlad's resistance led to cycles of invasion, retaliation, and destruction that took a heavy toll on the people of Wallachia. Leadership requires balancing the desire for independence with the responsibility to protect the well-being of those under one's care. The legend of Vlad the Impaler, intertwined with the myth of Dracula, offers yet another lesson. The stories we tell about leaders shape their legacy. Vlad's use of fear, amplified by the pamphlets of his enemies, transformed him into a monster in the eyes of Europe. Over time, these stories evolved into the Dracula myth, overshadowing the complex realities of his rule and reducing him to a symbol of bloodthirst and darkness. This transformation reminds us that history is shaped not only by what happens, but by how it is remembered and retold. Leaders must be mindful that their actions will be interpreted through the lenses of those who follow, and that reputation, once established, can become as powerful as reality itself. Finally, Vlad's life invites us to consider the nature of leadership during crisis. His harsh methods, born from a world where betrayal was deadly and conquest was constant, reflect the desperate measures leaders sometimes take to preserve stability and autonomy. While his choices may be judged harshly by modern standards, they can also be understood as the actions of a man navigating impossible circumstances with the tools he believed were necessary. In the quiet dawn over Wallachia, as the mists rise from the rivers and the forests whisper under the breeze, the story of Vlad the Impaler remains a complex and haunting reflection of the human struggle for power, safety, and survival. It challenges us to question how we judge leaders of the past, to recognize the circumstances that shape their choices, and to learn from their successes and failures. Conclusion. As dawn quietly spreads over the misty forests and slow rivers of Wallachia, we leave behind the footsteps of Vlad the Impaler, a figure caught between the sharp edges of history and the soft shadows of legend. His rule was harsh, built on fear and iron resolve. Yet within that harshness was a determination to protect a fragile land from betrayal and conquest, even when the world demanded impossible choices. To some, Vlad remains a hero who stood firm against the encroaching might of the Ottoman Empire, refusing to bow to demands for tribute and defending his people with a strength few could match. To others, he is a symbol of cruelty, a man whose methods blurred the line between justice and terror, leaving roads lined with stakes and stories that would echo across Europe for centuries. In the end, Vlad's story is not simply one of darkness or heroism. It is a reflection of a world where survival often required hard decisions, where the fear of conquest and betrayal shaped leaders into figures as complex as the times they lived in. His transformation into Dracula reminds us that stories, once told, can shape how we remember those who came before, turning men into myths, and myths into mirrors through which we view ourselves. As the winds whisper over Wallachia, the memory of Vlad the Impaler lingers, reminding us to learn from the past, to question the stories we inherit, and to see even in darkness the lessons that guide us toward the light.